An elderly man sat in a lecture hall at the University of Vienna, his face etched with confusion. Throughout his life, he had studied the art of alchemy at the University of Oxford, where he was among its most honored professors. However, after the crushing defeat by the German Empire, which obliterated their entire army in minutes, the Kingdom of England became a mere puppet of the Reich. Consequently, this aging professor was sent to the University of Vienna to uncover the secrets held within the German sacred halls of higher learning. Currently, he sat in a lecture hall, attending Chemistry 101. Around him were bright-eyed, 22-year-olds, fresh from military service. These young men, like all students at this prestigious university, would be the backbone of the Reich's future academic endeavors. Having benefited from the robust education system established by the Kaiser, they understood every word the professor spoke and quickly jotted down their notes. In contrast, the old man felt like a fish out of water. He had dedicated his life to alchemy, only to realize it was all nonsense. The basic principles of chemistry had completely. The class was being lectured on the basics of atomic structure, a concept the alchemist found nearly impossible to grasp. As a professor at the University of Oxford, an institution that had existed for centuries before any German university had emerged, he had arrived at this school with a haughty attitude. However, the experience was humbling, and he was now forced to confront the limitations of his once revered field. Note means upended his worldview. This phrase is more natural in Chinese, but in English, we can say shaken his worldview or upended his reality to maintain the original meaning. However, after spending a single day listening to the German lecturers, the aging alchemist realized how utterly foolish he had been. While scribbling down his notes, the old man could not help but question the information he was writing. The words used in the course might as well have been ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, as he could not decipher their meaning at all. Seeing that he was falling behind, Nigel felt compelled to ask the question on his mind, which he did by raising his hand. Upon noticing that the guest from England had a question, the German professor, who was less than half the old man's age, had a smug grin on his face as he called upon him. "Professor Nigel Bradshaw from the University of Oxford, was it? Do you have something to add?" All eyes turned to the old man and his hunched back as the German students whispered and chuckled at his expense. Every word spoken was laced with arrogance, which Nigel found hard to endure. Finally, after several moments of awkward whispers, the old man rose from his seat and spoke the words that filled his mind. "What exactly is this atom you keep speaking of?" Immediately, the entire class broke out into laughter, and the German students openly mocked the elderly English professor in their native tongue. With the raising of the German professor's hand, they suddenly silenced themselves. The professor tried to keep a friendly facade, but deep down, he had only contempt for the old fool who had dared to enter his lecture hall without even a basic high school level understanding of science. Naturally, his response was as arrogant, if not more so, than the students who had openly mocked the English professor. "Sir, I believe it would be best if you spent your time in a less advanced course. If you do not even know what an atom is, then I'm afraid you are not fit to study at our prestigious university. I'm sure one of our many high schools would be happy to educate you on the basics of physics and chemistry." Nigel was stunned into silence. Never in his wildest dreams did he think he would be laughed out of a foreign university's lecture hall. However, with the German professor's crass remark, this is exactly what happened. In the city of Königsberg, a finely dressed young woman sat in a doctor's office with her child in her lap. The little girl, in her formative years, had a wide smile on her face while playing with the toys left in the lobby for her and the other patients' entertainment. Suddenly, the door opened, and a nurse appeared with a clipboard in hand. She called out into the lobby with a single name. "Monica Wagner?" The mother immediately grabbed her child and stashed the toy away where it belonged before walking toward the nurse with a rather nervous expression on her face. "That would be us." The nurse had seen such a sight too many times to count and thus had a comforting smile as she handed the mother the clipboard while giving her a brief summary of what would soon occur. "Just fill out your daughter's information, and we'll have her immunized in a matter of minutes." The mother was obviously anxious. As someone who had been immunized herself, she felt sticking a hypodermic needle into her little girl's arm was a bit excessive. However, the Kaiser had decreed that all children were to be immunized against certain diseases such as smallpox, polio, measles, and several others. Thus, she had no choice but to fill out the form regarding her daughter's personal information and health background. The girl followed her mother into the doctor's room, where they waited for his arrival. It was not long before the pediatrician arrived with a wide smile on his face. "So this is Monica? She's grown since the last time I saw her. Well, I'll make this quick so you don't have to waste any more of your time." After saying this, the man pulled out the measles vaccine and held the girl's arm. A slight bit of fear appeared in the girl's eyes as she saw the needle coming her way, but she did not resist. Instead, she looked at her mother with a pleading gaze, but the woman responded to her daughter with a defeated tone. "Monica, be a good girl and stay still for the doctor. Once we're done here, Mommy will take you out for some ice cream." Hearing about the treat, Monica looked away from the needle, which was quickly approaching her arm, and gritted her teeth. Without realizing it, the needle had entered her flesh, and the vaccine had been administered into her bloodstream. By the time Monica looked back, the needle had already been removed, and the doctor properly disposed of it. With a friendly smile, he handed the girl a lollipop and complimented her for her bravery. "Monica is really brave. Here's a lollipop as a reward for your courage." Seeing the candy, a wide smile formed on the girl's face, and she forgot about the vaccine she had just received. Afterward, the mother sighed with relief and had a brief discussion with the doctor about the girl's next checkup before leaving the hospital. In the German Empire, occurrences like this were common, and the robust public health system ensured that parents did not worry about the expense. After all, in Berengar's view, healthcare was a necessity in life, and people should not be charged for such services. A group of high school boys walked through the streets of Kufstein in their uniforms. With classes over, they had decided to hit the town to enjoy themselves before finally going home for the evening. However, the trio could not easily agree on what to do, and were thus debating how to spend their afternoon. "Man, I think we should go to the cinema. There's a new movie called Frankenstein that just came out. I doubt any of you guys would be able to sit through it without wetting your pants." However, another friend immediately disagreed with this proposal and presented his own idea. "Nah, man, screw that. We should go to the carnival. I hear it's back in town. Think of all the fun we could have there. Games, prizes, food. Who needs the cinema when we have such an option?" The third boy, who had remained silent until this moment, quickly dismissed both ideas as he spoke about something the other two had neglected. "Hey, isn't there a fight at the Grand Kufstein Arena tonight? Why don't we see if we can get some tickets? If not, we can always hit the local tavern and watch it there. Hell, I could go for some hot wings right now. What do you guys say?" Immediately upon hearing this option, the other two boys dropped any notions of going to the cinema or the carnival and nodded in agreement. However, before they could speak, a feminine voice interrupted them. "That's the best idea I've heard all night. You boys mind if we join you?" Upon hearing this, the trio looked around to see three girls roughly their age, dressed in uniforms from a different school. Two of the three boys instantly became nervous when they saw the girls approach so boldly. As for the boy who suggested watching the fight, he had a confident smirk on his face as he approached the leader of the three girls. "Sure, I don't mind, but won't your parents worry if you don't return home before it gets dark?" The teenage girl responded with an equally confident expression, crossing her arms. "I'll just tell Daddy that I was at a friend's house. However, don't think that just because we're joining you, you can take advantage of us. If anything happens, I'll have you take responsibility." The boy chuckled when he heard this and nodded before responding to the girl's taunt. "I can accept those terms. After all, I wouldn't mind having a girl as cute as you as my wife." Upon hearing this, the girl blushed and looked away for a moment, before latching onto the boy's arm and following him to the Grand Kufstein Arena along with their friends. While Berengar was spending the weekend in Vienna, entertaining the world's leaders, Linda was hard at work in the city of Kufstein. It was not easy negotiating a high-level defection. For Minna to switch sides and learn to competently spy on Itami, it would be one of the most difficult tasks the red-headed spymaster had ever undertaken. Naturally, she could not get involved herself, but Linda had a very powerful pawn, a person who would be able to thoroughly convince Minna to side with the Reich. Since she was first taken captive, the Josian princess had unknowingly begun to develop feelings for the German agent responsible for her interrogation. After informing Minna about her family's deaths, Agent Friedrich Ziegler accompanied the woman for some time, ensuring she received the comfort she needed before finally returning to the headquarters of German Imperial Intelligence. There, the veteran agent knelt before the Kaiserin and bowed his head as if he were the most obedient of dogs. Linda did not even pay the man any attention as she looked through the report in her hands. To her, it was only natural that her agents kneeled before her, a level of respect not even the Kaiser was afforded by his soldiers. Why did the men of Imperial Intelligence bow their heads and kneel before their boss in such a submissive manner? Because she was, without a doubt, the most terrifying human being on the planet. If they accidentally gazed upon her with lust, the rumors said she would have them blinded for their sins. In truth, no agent had ever been so cruelly punished, but no man was foolish enough to test the director's patience. Everyone knew how much Linda loved her husband, her devotion to him was borderline fanatical. Any man who gazed upon her with lust was tainting her, something she would never allow. In the entirety of German Imperial Intelligence, Linda had practically become a goddess, worshipped by a devoted following. An idol, never to be marred by impure thoughts. If Agent Ziegler even glanced at her the wrong way, he would face the wrath of her angry admirers. Thus, he was sweating profusely, keeping his head hung low. Never before in his life had he been in the presence of the director. Now, kneeling before her, he did not dare to speak, fearing he might upset her. After several minutes of tense silence, Linda finally sighed and tossed the folder aside, as if its contents had lost her interest. A stern expression appeared on her flawless face as she rebuked the man for his lack of effort. I am told it is highly likely that one of your prisoners has developed feelings for you. It's no surprise, after all, you are a relatively handsome man, and an experienced girl like Minna is bound to fall for a pretty face, especially one who treats her nicely. This is actually why I chose you to interrogate the Josian princess. Well, that, and your apparent psychopathic tendencies. At the very least, I know that whatever happens, you will never grow attached to the woman. So, Friedrich, how certain are you of your ability to charm Minna further? Cold sweat dripped from Friedrich's forehead as he considered a precise answer. He feared that if he was off by even a single percentage, it would mark the end of his career. After several moments, he spoke up with a cracked voice. I am 99% certain that I can make Minna fall for me. In fact, given her current depressed state, she is particularly vulnerable to such influence. However, forgive me for asking, God Director, but what purpose would such a scheme have? A slight sneer appeared on Linda's lips as she heard the agent slip up. Naturally, she was aware of the cult of personality that had formed around her. In fact, she did not mind what her devotees called her behind her back. After all, the only woman fitting to be Saint Berengar, the blessed soulmate, was a goddess. However, she never wanted to hear such unprofessionalism in person. After careful consideration, Linda ultimately decided to ignore this slip-up and simply lectured the man on his responsibilities instead. I want you to make Minna fall so head over heels in love with you that she will do whatever you say without question. Once she is charmed, I want you to float the idea of working for Imperial Intelligence. I want her to spy on Empress Itami for us. If she resists such a suggestion, I want you to assure her that you will be in her corner as her sole means of contact. Once she agrees, I will have her appropriately trained in the art of espionage before selling her back to Japan. I'm sure this won't be a problem for you, will it? Agent Ziegler shook his head frantically. There was a noticeable sense of anxiety written all over his face, but not because of his orders. Rather, it was due to the cold glare that Linda was giving him. After taking a few moments to find his courage, he finally spoke in agreement with the terms presented to him. No problem. I assure you that I will follow your orders to the letter. Linda's stern expression turned into a warm smile as she heard these words, a smile that was more than enough to melt even the most cold-hearted killer's heart. Agent Ziegler gazed upon the beautiful expression for a moment before bowing his head, afraid that if he continued to gaze upon the woman's flawless appearance for even a second more, the red-headed temptress would steal his soul away. The man's panicked expression caused Linda's pretty smile to turn into a sadistic grin, and she nodded her head 3 times in approval. Only after several moments of silence did she deign to grace him with her heavenly voice. "Good. I won't keep you any longer. If you encounter any complications with your task, report them to your direct superior. I'm sure I don't need to remind you about the consequences of wasting my precious time." Agent Ziegler immediately nodded, gathered his thoughts, and departed from the room. When he left, he gave one last glance toward the director, who had immediately returned to her paperwork as if their discussion had not even fazed her. With a sigh of relief, the agent departed from the headquarters, only letting his thoughts escape once he knew no one was listening. Such a terrifying woman. I will never know how the Kaiser has managed to tame her. As for Linda, she continued her work until the sun began to set, then she left her office and returned home. Although her beloved husband was not there to greet her, 4 of her 5 lovely children were. Seeing their beaming smiles filled her with a joy that only a mother could truly experience, allowing her to relax after a stressful day at work. As the Vienna Accords came to an end, ushering in a new era of human relations, another world-changing event occurred on the other side of the map. In the jungles of Burma, the 12th Panzer Division, along with the Anangpur Army, advanced through the easternmost territory of the Bengal Empire, bringing the local population under their control. Unlike when the Bengal troops entered the jungles of Burma, committing numerous atrocities, there was no major bloodshed this time. In fact, the German soldiers were exceptionally kind to the natives, understanding well how they had been treated by their previous conquerors. What could only be described as a celebration ensued when the combined forces of the German and Anangpur empires swept through the streets, driving out any Bengal presence. When the people realized they had been liberated, they greeted the Allied soldiers with open arms. The war for India, a conflict that had dragged on for some time, finally came to an end. This news was transmitted back to the Reich as quickly as it had occurred. When Berengar heard of it, he was at a local tavern with other world leaders. A member of Berengar's Leibgard entered the facility and whispered the news to his Kaiser. Upon hearing the good news, Berengar ordered another round for himself and his guests. Just before they were about to take a sip, he stood up and announced his victory to the rulers of the world's mightiest empires. "I have some good news to share with all of you. As we speak, the last bastion of Bengal resistance in Asia has fallen. The war is over, and because of this, I now proclaim in front of all of you that Daria Tamara is no longer the emperor of Anangpur but of all of India." Daria was stunned to hear this news. Though he knew that any day the Bengal Empire, or what little remained of it, would fall, now that the day had finally come, he found it hard to believe. Surprisingly, to no one but Daria himself, all the other monarchs seated alongside him gave their congratulations. After all, a unified India allowed for many trade opportunities between their empires. Despite their praise, more than a few of the monarchs eyed Berengar with envy, fully aware that this newly formed empire, with unlimited potential, was nothing more than a puppet of the Reich and its cunning Kaiser. It was only after things had settled down that Berengar posed a question to Daria that the man had not considered. "So tell me, Daria, will you be proclaiming the formation of your new empire here in Vienna, or will you wait to make the announcement when you return home?" The boy emperor looked at the man, who had been his foster father in many ways, with a hint of suspicion in his eyes. He had not received much training on how to be an effective ruler. In fact, all he had really learned was how to be an exceptional puppet. However, if Berengar was asking this question, he clearly had ulterior motives. Thus, Daria was forced to think clearly, which he did for several moments of awkward silence. While he pondered this, the other monarchs exchanged glances between the two men, wondering what the boy would choose. Everyone knew the significance of announcing the formation of the Indian Empire within the city of Vienna. Daria was invited as a guest to the Reich for an international peace conference. While he was away, his forces emerged victorious in a campaign against the army of a convicted war criminal. Though the monarchs had technically finished their work early, the Vienna Peace Accords were officially scheduled to last all weekend. Announcing the formation of an empire during this conference was a strong statement of commitment to the ideals upon which the treaty was founded. It also symbolically recognized the German Empire's role in the formation of this newly unified Indian state. While Daria sat in silence, contemplating his next move, Berengar sipped his drink with a smug smile on his handsome face. In truth, Berengar already knew how Daria would respond, even if Daria himself did not realize it. Not only did Berengar possess the Eye of Horus, which revealed one's hidden emotions toward him, but he was also a master manipulator and an excellent judge of character. From the moment Berengar first sent his forces into India, he had planned for these two events to converge at approximately the same time, all for this very moment. After several moments of awkward silence, Daria sighed and forced a smile as he responded to Berengar's question in the affirmative. "It would be my honor to announce the formation of my new empire here in Vienna, assuming you are willing to accept this." Berengar chuckled lightly before gripping Daria on the shoulder, both to show his approval of Daria's decision and as a sign of dominance before the other major world leaders. With a satisfied expression, Berengar said the words Daria had already anticipated. "My friend, the honor is all mine." After saying this, Berengar, Daria, and the other world leaders enjoyed a night out in the city of Vienna, celebrating all they had accomplished that day. The following day, the world leaders gathered at the City Hall of Vienna once more, where, in front of a large audience of journalists from across the Reich, they made a major announcement. Berengar stood by Daria's side as he eloquently spoke the words that would usher in a new era of Indian politics. As of last night, the last remnant of the Bengal army surrendered to the coalition of German and Anangpur troops. With this, the war for the region has come to a close, and I would like to formally announce the unification of the Indian subcontinent under the Anangpur Empire. We are no longer just a small state in the northwestern portion of the Indian subcontinent, we now encompass the entire region. I hereby announce the formation of the Indian Empire, to be ruled by the Tomara dynasty from this day until the end of days. I assure you all that I will work hard alongside Kaiser Berengar von Kufstein to ensure that relations between India and the Reich are well maintained. Thank you all for your time." With these words, the Indian Empire was officially formed, and Daria was now the ruler of Berengar's largest and most powerful ally. Berengar intended to mobilize this new empire against the Japanese when the time for war finally arrived. As for India's development, like all of his allies, Berengar fully intended to transform it from a feudal state into a peak pre-industrial civilization. The military, of course, would be well funded and supplied by the Reich, with a level of technology on par with, if not slightly superior to, that of the Joseon Kingdom and the Majapahit Empire. In the coming days, Berengar would work side by side with Daria to overhaul the Indian military and introduce agricultural reforms across the newly established empire. He also had plans to smuggle tea plants from the Ming dynasty into India, so he could produce his own supply of this valuable substance on German-owned lands. After all, if there was one luxury good that Berengar lacked in domestic production, it was tea, something many of his citizens had begun to enjoy as much, if not more, than coffee. With this in mind, Berengar intended to claim a section of the market for himself, now a possibility with the formation of the Indian Empire. As for Daria, he would stay within the borders of the Reich for a few more days, visiting Kufstein and his much-beloved sister. Little did the Indian emperor realize that his German counterpart had already impregnated his dear little sister. This fact would cause considerable concern when he learned about it. Who was the Kaiser, if not the most cunning and manipulative man to ever walk the earth? For the Indian princess to enter the man's harem and carry his child meant only one thing: Berengar von Kufstein intended to place his own offspring on the Indian throne, which Daria had only recently established. Upon understanding this, Daria would become deeply concerned about his future. In the middle of the German Aerial Warfare Academy's cafeteria, a pretty young blonde woman sat alone, staring at the contents of one of the nation's more popular tabloids. An image of herself seated on the back of the German prince's motorcycle was plastered across the front page, alongside a scandalous headline: "Is the Princess of Bavaria Prince Hans's new side piece?" It took significant effort for Anne not to scowl at this piece of trash. However, she maintained a pretty, though stern, face while waiting for her boyfriend to arrive. After all, the last thing she needed was to be scowling when Hans finally sat down next to her. Despite her facade, the moment Hans arrived at the table with a tray in his hands, he immediately noticed that Anne was in a sour mood and quickly inquired about what had caused her anger. "And, what's wrong?" The Princess of Bavaria remained silent and instead handed the tabloid to him, which quickly caused him to smirk. A confident expression on his handsome, yet youthful face, Hans was quick to console his girlfriend. "Is this it? So what? Isn't this a good thing? Now that news of our relationship is spreading, that fat sack of crap will come into the limelight. In fact, if I really wanted to, I could get my mother to manipulate the media to expose his sinful behavior. Once everything he has done is in the public eye, Prince of Saxony or not, he will be in hot water. And merely sighed and nodded her head. She understood that this would undoubtedly help expose her fiancé's cruelty, and in doing so might actually get her out of the betrothal her father had forced upon her. However, she still found fault with the headline and was quick to express her grievances. Is this all that I am to you? Just a side piece? The young prince was astounded that the woman had taken such offense to what was clearly a salacious headline designed to grab attention with a quick glance. Still, there was a clear expression of discontent on Anne's face, which prompted Hans to take her hand and comfort her with his words. Of course not. I already told you, once my betrothal to that woman is broken, I will gladly take your hand in marriage as one of my lawful wives. I'm not like my father. I have no intention of keeping several mistresses, despite having 4 wives. 5 women are more than enough for me to be happy. Had Anne grown up in the previous generation, she would have found that statement laughable. However, she was raised in the polygamous society that Berengar had created, where the idea of one man having several wives was as normal to her as having breakfast every morning. The concept of mistresses or concubines, whatever one might call them, was not exactly common in the Reich. However, as the Kaiser, Berengar could do whatever he wanted, so he kept a few women on the side. This was something that Hans disapproved of, believing these women, aside from his Aunt Henrietta, were unworthy of his father's time and energy. In fact, Hans sighed in lament when he thought about his father taking another mistress, which he could not help but express. I heard that my father took another foreign beauty into his harem. This time, it's the princess of the Golden Horde. Apparently, part of his negotiations was that she bear his child. I can't help but think that my father intends to seat his own offspring on all the world's major thrones. And scoffed at this remark. Her first instinct was to deny it, frankly, because it was ludicrous. However, when she thought more clearly, Berengar had taken wives and concubines from across the world. The Sultan of Al-Andalus was his child, and the heir to the Byzantine throne was another of his sons. It would be no exaggeration to say that, with the right amount of scheming, the future emperor of India could also be Berengar's child. The same could be said for the Majapahit Empire. Now, the princess of the Golden Horde had fallen into his clutches as well? Upon further inspection, all the petty kingdoms in Europe had at least one of their princesses engaged to one of Berengar's sons. Those who didn't would ultimately be ruled by one of the German princes when they came of age. After several moments of awkward silence, Anne stared at Hans with a gawking expression. She could hardly believe it, but the more she thought about it, the more this theory seemed true. She could only shake her head and sigh before expressing her thoughts. Your father is truly unfathomable. Such a scheme is nearly impossible, and yet in 100 years, every kingdom and empire in this world will be ruled by members of your father's dynasty. If you hadn't said anything about this, I would never have expected it. Hans scoffed when he heard this and shifted his gaze to Anne. There was a look of fear in his eyes as he murmured beneath his breath, I highly doubt this is my father's doing. There's only one person in this world with the cunning and lascivious nature to concoct such a massive conspiracy, and that would be my mother. No disrespect to my father, but I doubt he would even think of such a thing without my mother whispering it into his ear. When Anne heard this, she didn't know how to react. She couldn't fathom why any woman would want her husband to impregnate other women. In fact, she quickly disagreed with Hans's assessment. No, that doesn't make sense. What would Linda possibly gain from such a thing? After all, these are not her children who will be ruling the world, but her husband's. A bitter smile appeared on Hans's lips as he shook his head in disagreement before arguing his point. When he did, a look of shock and a flush of embarrassment appeared on Anne's face. You don't know my mother very well, do you? First and foremost, the woman can be incredibly petty, possibly more than anyone else on the planet. Though she was elevated to the level of empress, she was born a lowly count's daughter. I don't doubt for a second that she gets some form of sick joy from watching the man she chose deflower and taint those noble princesses, taking them as mere concubines rather than giving them the wedding ring they would surely get with any other man. Second, my mother is what you might call a cuckween. She derives pleasure from watching the man she loves be intimate with other women. In fact, the entire royal harem is her brainchild. You have no idea what levels of degeneracy my father gets up to with his wives and concubines, and my mother is the mastermind of it all. Third, and most importantly, my mother is fiercely devoted to my father. She loves him more than anything in this world. I mean, she practically worships him as her god. Naturally, because of this, she wants nothing more than to help him accomplish his goals in any way she can. Building an empire that will last 1,000 years is something my father has already set the foundations for. But making that empire rule above all others as the world's only superpower? That requires a level of stability that can only result from all the world's leaders sharing a common lineage, my father's lineage. After hearing all of this, and could no longer look Hans in the eye. She felt like she had learned more about the boy's mother than she ever wanted to. To think that the stunning and beautiful Kaiserin, whom she always looked up to, actually had such a fetish, it was something she had never expected. However, after thinking about this for some time, and had one question on her mind, which she felt compelled to ask. I'm sorry, but how do you know all of this about your mother? Hans simply sighed and shook his head before answering the girl with a defeated expression on his face. I'm a keen observer. Let's leave it at that. Though this only created more questions for her, she decided to leave the topic alone, fearing that if she delved further, she would discover something even more intense than what she had already heard. In the Austrian Alps, there was a large military base where thousands of conscripts worked together to complete their basic training. A young man, no older than 18, was doing push-ups while dressed in his Feldgrau fatigues, along with the rest of his unit. Manfred Krauss was a young Austrian man who had recently finished high school and the German Cadet Corps. Now, he was just another cog in the German war machine, fulfilling his mandatory service like all other young men had to do. As Manfred continued his physical exercise, he heard the shouting of his drill instructor, who was screaming at another conscript. You unbelievable fat sack of shit! When I was your age, we had nothing to eat but a single roll of bread a day. How on earth did you manage to get so fucking huge, you lard-ass landwhale? You are an utter disgrace to the fatherland. Look at those around you. They are effortlessly doing this exercise because they have trained their entire lives for this. If you do not meet my quota of push-ups today, I will have you scrubbing the latrines with your toothbrush. Do you understand me, Private? There were practically tears in the heavy-set conscript's eyes as he heard these words. He was by no means morbidly obese. In fact, he wasn't all that big, at least not when compared to the American people during Berengar's past life. However, in the Reich, where discipline, exercise, and martial training were the virtues of all men, anything other than a six-pack was considered fat. Maintaining such a physique was more difficult for some than others, and this young conscript simply enjoyed his beer and hot wings a bit too much. Because of that, his muscles were not as clearly defined as everyone else's. Despite the insults hurled at him, the conscript endured and responded to the drill instructor with an enthusiasm that Manfred struggled to comprehend. Yes, sir. After this brief incident, the physical training continued for some time before Manfred and the others were lined up at the firing line and issued their training rifles. Like most soldiers in the German army, they were given rifles modeled after the FG-42 from Berengar's past life. After loading the 20-round box magazine into the side of the gun, Manfred aimed down his sights and pulled the trigger. The bipod stabilized the weapon, allowing for much easier hits on the steel plates, which sat at a distance of roughly 100 meters. Having hit all his targets in a sufficient amount of time, Manfred was scored fairly for his shooting capabilities, and he and the rest of the men continued their daily routine. After all their work for the day was done, Manfred arrived at the mess hall, where he saw the fat man eating alone. After careful consideration, he took his tray of food and sat down next to the man, introducing himself. I'm Manfred Krauss. What's your name? The fat man looked up from his tray of food and gave Manfred one glance before staring at his plate again. He responded in a rather dejected manner. Wolfgang. Wolfgang Bergman. Upon getting a name, Manfred smiled and tried to ease into a friendly conversation. He honestly felt bad for the guy after what he went through earlier in the day, so he had decided to befriend him. So, what job did you sign up for? I'm a Panzer crewman.
Personally, I want to ride into battle in one of those new Panther tanks, you know, the Model B.
I hear they have a sighting system that allows them to see in the dead of night.
Isn't that awesome?
When Wolfgang heard this, he was pleasantly surprised. At first, he thought Manfred was just being annoying, but after learning that they both had the same job, he suddenly became more interested in the conversation. Thus, he was quick to respond with a rather enthusiastic tone in his voice.
Really? Huh, I thought I was the only one in our unit.
It's nice to see there's a guy I can rely on who isn't just another numbskull with a rifle. Manfred chuckled when he heard these words. It was true that there were a lot of men in this camp who wanted nothing more than to rush into machine gun fire with a rifle in hand, hoping for a vain shot at glory. The infantry was never lacking in those who wished to enter its service. However, in Manfred's opinion, it took a more cultured man to operate a panzer, and thus, he felt something akin to a bond forming between him and Wolfgang. With this in mind, he expressed good intentions to the man before continuing to eat his meal.
Well, I hope we end up in the same unit.
With a simple nod of his head, Wolfgang silently expressed the same sentiment. While Wolfgang and Manfred shared a meal together in the mess hall, another group of German conscripts were training at sea outside Trieste. These men weren't going through basic training but rather specialized training, which consisted of learning how to operate a German U-boat. One man in particular was eyeing the sonar as the U-boat and its crew slipped beneath the surface of the Mediterranean. For their mission, they would be making a short journey outside Gibraltar, where they would intercept a dummy target and destroy it with their torpedoes. The Type 1 U-boat was modeled after the late-war Type XXI submarine with some much-needed upgrades. It was a submarine designed to operate primarily underwater, and as a result, it could stay beneath the surface for several days without revealing itself. As the sonar operator watched his device closely, he noticed a few blips appear and quickly reported them to the commander. "Sir, there appears to be a small fleet of what I presume are wooden merchant ships about 200 clicks to the west.
We are quickly approaching them.
What are your orders?" The commander of the submarine simply scoffed before giving his orders to the crew. There was a hint of arrogance in his gruff voice.
Maintain our current speed and depth. As long as we are not on a collision course, you do not need to report your findings to me. Continue as you were.
With a slight sigh, the sonar technician accepted his orders. Seeing the man's overeagerness rejected so swiftly by their commanding officer, a nearby sailor patted him on the back and attempted to cheer him up.
Relax, Reiner, you don't need to be so uptight.
I know we're underwater, but these things are pretty solid.
There hasn't been an incident of a submarine sinking yet. Reiner Schulz took a deep breath and sighed in relief. When he first heard about submarines, he became fascinated with them. However, now that he was actually inside one, he felt as if his stomach was twisted into a hefty knot. Exploring the depths of the Mediterranean, let alone the world's oceans, was a lot more terrifying than he had thought. He was not alone in this, as the man who comforted him appeared to be sweating profusely, which Reiner was quick to joke about. You all right there, Klaus? You don't seem to be faring any better than me.
Despite appearing visibly anxious, Klaus chuckled and laughed off Reiner's attempts to console him as if they were one big joke.
Me? I'm fine. It's you I'm worried about. The two men shared a brief laugh before resuming their tasks.
Their brief interaction helped calm each other's nerves, even if they were not willing to admit how terrified they truly were at that moment. Berengar sat in the dining hall of his royal palace. Across from him were the Byzantine emperor and the princess of the Golden Horde. Despite the treaty that both sides had agreed to, neither had ever spoken in person, relying instead on the Kaiser to draft and organize the event. In the wake of the Vienna peace accords, Berengar ensured that both Daria and Vetranis stayed behind and followed him back to Kufstein for two separate reasons. While the Indian emperor was off visiting his sister and catching up on their lives, Berengar sat down with these two rivals to settle their affairs once and for all. Coronation had a cold expression on her beautiful face. She did not seem to care for Vetranis in the slightest, nor recognize his authority as the once mighty Byzantine emperor. Vetranis, on the other hand, sat across from the Mongol princess with a stoic expression and a graceful facade. Witnessing the atmosphere created when these two rulers came together, Berengar felt as if the air had grown colder. With a heavy sigh, he expressed his thoughts on the treaty he was practically forcing the two monarchs to sign. As I have already informed both of you, the terms of this treaty are that the Byzantine Empire will make its best effort to help relocate the scattered Golden Horde back to their previous holdings. Any ground gained in this war by the Golden Horde will be forfeit and returned to its previous owners. The Golden Horde will pay reparations to both the Byzantine Empire and the Kingdom of Georgia in the form of silver and gold, which they are obligated to pay within the next 50 years in an amount roughly 10 times the damage they have caused in their conquest. As for the Reich, by virtue of brokering this agreement, the Golden Horde recognizes our right to mine wherever we see fit within the borders of their new kingdom for the next 100 years. In exchange for these liberties, I, Kaiser Berengar von Kufstein, hereby pledge to invest in the creation and development of your new state for the foreseeable future. As a token of my sincerity, I will start with a sum of 500 billion marks.
How does that sound?
Betranis nearly choked on his own spit when he heard this figure.
500 billion marks? His entire empire, in its current state, wasn't even worth such a massive fortune.
All of a sudden, he felt like he was the one being cheated. After all, he had to invest his own money into the reconstruction of his empire.
Yet Berengar was going to invest 500 billion marks into the creation of a semi-modern state in the middle of the Caucasus, all in exchange for mining rights? Just what natural resources was the Golden Horde sitting on?
Despite the Byzantine emperor's expression of utter shock, Coronation did not seem the slightest bit fazed. This was largely because she had no idea just how much 500 billion marks were worth.
However, judging by the Byzantine emperor's reaction, it seemed to be a lot.
Thus, she nodded her head in silence, signaling for Berengar to continue. And he was quick to do so. All right, since we have all agreed on these terms, if you would sign your name on the dotted line, we will be able to wrap things up shortly. Having said this, Berengar took the initiative and signed his name on the document before handing the treaty over to Emperor Betranis. The man had barely recovered from his shock. Perhaps, if he had been more coherent, he would have tried to renegotiate his part of the agreement. However, because he was so stunned by the news, Betranis mindlessly signed his name on the document while still thinking about everything he would do if Berengar had given him such a vast fortune. Coronation used her interpreter to ensure everything was in order and was about to sign her name when she realized something important was missing. Her brow raised slightly as her cold black eyes shifted to Berengar's handsome face. A rather stiff expression appeared on the woman's plump lips as she struggled to find the resolve to voice her complaint. After a moment, she boldly stated her problem with the treaty.
"Where is the stipulation that demands I carry your child?"
When Betranis heard this, his eyes nearly shot out of their sockets.
Did Berengar seriously force this woman to agree to such a thing?
He could hardly believe his ears. The Kaiser already had 4 beautiful wives and 3 stunning concubines, which Betranis himself was aware of.
Yet, the man so shamelessly wanted another foreign beauty added to the list? Just what kind of sex drive did this man even have?
What was even more shocking was that Berengar did not deny it. Instead, he simply smiled politely before responding to the woman's concern. "Pardon me, but I genuinely did not think such a thing needed to be written into law.
You can imagine the trouble I would be in if such an agreement came to light later in life. It would be quite the scandal.
So, I have decided to leave that particular stipulation to your own discretion. I am sure you will live up to your promise when the time finally comes.
Now, would you just sign your name so we can be done with all this mess?"
Betranis was practically gawking at his son-in-law when he heard the man openly admit to this accusation. He thought for sure that the Mongol beauty would fly into a fit of rage when he rejected her concern, but instead, she simply sighed in defeat before doing as she was told. "There, I have signed your treaty.
Now you have to fulfill your end of the bargain." Berengar smiled and nodded in agreement before responding to the woman's curt behavior.
"Oh, believe me, I always live up to my agreements. After your people have been rounded up and returned to their lands, I will send my men and their equipment to begin the construction of a proper city. Perhaps somewhere close to the Black Sea, so trade between our realms is easier. We will teach your people proper agriculture and begin the construction of our mines. As agreed, these will be leased to the Reich for a period of 100 years, after which you and your people will have full rights to whatever remains. You have my word."
Coronation didn't entirely trust the golden-eyed man. If she could, the spirits would not have warned her about him. However, they had been oddly quiet ever since she was first taken into captivity, and thus she could only rely on her instincts to navigate the complex relationship that had been forced upon her. As for Vetranes, he was still in disbelief. No matter how he thought about it, he could not comprehend why Berengar was investing so much into the development of an empire in the Caucasus. Naturally, he would feel this way, as the man was completely unaware of the rich deposits of oil, natural gas, uranium, and other critical resources that lay across its vast landscape. With the treaty signed, Berengar felt he had more important matters to attend to. He stood up from his seat and bid his guests farewell for the time being. "I will speak with both of you at a later time. For now, I have some affairs to settle with the Indian emperor and his sister. Until we meet again." Having said this, Berengar exited the room, leaving the princess of the Golden Horde and the Byzantine emperor alone in an awkward silence. While Berengar was negotiating with Emperor Vetranes and Princess Coronation, Daria was in a room alone with his sister. The beautiful young Indian woman had a healthy glow to her appearance and a wide smile on her face, as she was finally able to see her brother after what felt like a lifetime away from him. For the early part of her life, Priya had been locked up in a small room, where the only person who ever cared for her was her elder brother. However, the life she once knew drastically changed when the boy emperor willingly went into exile, all for the sake of her health. In the years Priya spent in Kufstein, she developed a love for German culture and the people who contributed to it. She no longer dressed in traditional Indian attire but instead wore some of the finest silk dresses the Reich had to offer. The only time she ever wore a sari was when Berengar was in the mood for it. The Indian princess had even fallen in love with her foster father and was now carrying his child, thanks in part to Linda's manipulation of the man. Though she wasn't an official wife, Priya felt content with her life, living in lavish luxury and showered with love from her foster family. It wasn't just Berengar whom Priya had fallen in love with, but his entire family, especially his wife Yasmin, who was the mother the girl had never known. Though she was still a bit naive and immature, the man she loved more than anything protected her from the dangers of the world. As for Daria, since retaking his family's throne, his life had been harsh. He had no time to worry about taking a wife or a lover and spent nearly every waking hour managing his realm. Agriculture, plumbing, waste recycling, military advancements, and the sale of spices abroad, these were just a few of the pressing matters that required his constant attention. Without the brief education he had received in the Reich, he would surely have failed by now. Restoring a collapsing state to its former glory was something Daria could not manage alone. Instead, he relied on a long list of German advisors who assisted him at every step. For most of his life, he had thought he wanted to be free of his uncle's tyranny and reign as he saw fit. In reality, the throne itself was a chain he could never break free from. While his sister lived the fantasy life of a spoiled princess, he was neck-deep in the complexities only a ruler could understand. To add to it, he did so not for the glory and prosperity of his own people, but for the sake of his foreign masters, who were wolves in sheep's clothing. Though the Germans were the most powerful allies he could ask for, willing to invest countless funds and efforts into building a prosperous client state, they were also the worst enemies one could make. If Daria ever had any thoughts about liberating his people from the servitude of their German masters, his fate and that of his people would be worse than death. Naturally, Daria could not tell any of this to his beloved sister, as she had fallen in love with the tyrant who presided over the Reich. He was certain that if his lips ever slipped, the girl would undoubtedly tell everything to the man. Thus, the conversation he had with Priya was entirely superficial. However, the young woman's next words caught the young Indian emperor completely off guard. "By the way, I'm pregnant." Daria stood there in silence, as if his head had just been hit by a baseball bat, trying to recover his senses. What did his sister just say? She was pregnant? Then who was the father? Of course, he already knew the answer, but he could not help but question the words Priya had spoken. What? Who? Who dares lay their hands on my precious sister? I'll rip his intestines out and nail them to his body inch by inch. Before Priya could properly react to her brother's sudden rage, a slight knock sounded on the open door behind them. Berengar stood in the doorway with a smug smile on his face, gloating at the young man. That would be me. Are you going to rip my intestines out and nail them to my body inch by inch? Though I don't know how such a thing would be possible, I'm pretty sure you would run out of torso long before you could accomplish such a feat. Of course, it was Berengar. There was literally nobody else who could have impregnated the Indian emperor's little sister. However, to see the man so boldly admit it in front of him caused Daria to be filled with rage. He instantly turned to Berengar and walked up to the man as if he intended to strike him. Berengar found this laughable, as he was substantially taller than his Indian counterpart. However, before he could make a comment about this, Daria went off on him. You promised you wouldn't. As long as I obeyed your commands, you swore to me that you would not touch her. Berengar frowned when he heard this, looking down at Daria. He was very quick to clear the air in front of Priya. I promised you that as long as you didn't make my life difficult, I wouldn't force myself on the girl. However, I made it abundantly clear that if she approached me of her own accord, I wouldn't deny myself the pleasure of becoming intimate with her. I kept my promise, so don't make me out to be the bad guy here. Daria had no words for this. Everything Berengar said was accurate. Perhaps he was deluding himself, believing his sister would never fall for the man. Only now did he realize that Priya had developed feelings for Berengar long before he left to reclaim his birthright. He could no longer meet Berengar's gaze, which grew more smug by the second. So, Daria simply turned and walked out the door. Priya was about to run after her brother but was stopped by her lover before she could. In a cautious tone, he asked the question that weighed most heavily on his mind. Is what you said true? You're really pregnant? Priya nodded silently before looking away. She had thought her brother would be happy for her, but in the end, he was just as childish as she remembered. Sighing in defeat, she shared her thoughts with the man she loved. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. If I had, we could have avoided this mess. Had I known Daria would act this way, I would have come up with a better plan. If you'll excuse me, I need to go console my brother. Berengar kissed Priya on the cheek in a display of affection before sending her off to find Daria. He honestly hadn't expected the situation to deteriorate into such a sorry state. With Priya's cute bottom out of his view, Berengar could only sigh and lament. That boy is way too overprotective of his sister. I believe we used to call guys like him a siscon. After the Vienna peace accords concluded, and all the world's major rulers had returned to their homes, Berengar found himself with a surprising amount of free time. Aside from the issues with Daria, which Priya was addressing at that very moment, Berengar had few concerns to deal with for the time being. Perhaps because of this, he found himself dreadfully bored. So much so that he soon began complaining to Linda about his lack of stimulation. His words slightly perturbed the red-headed beauty, who was busy with her own work. Linda, my love, how about you take some time off and we go take a bath together? It's been a while since it's been just the two of us. While making this suggestion, Berengar clung to his lovely wife, kissing her neck passionately, an act that usually elicited a positive response. However, for some reason, the woman was not pleased with her husband and instead shoved him away as if he were nothing more than a nuisance. Berengar, my love, though your offer is tempting, I simply don't have time for such things at the moment. If I don't get this work done by the end of the day, there could be disastrous consequences. If you have so much free time, why don't you visit your parents? I can count on one hand the number of times you've spent with your mother and father since you so callously forced them into exile over a decade ago. Berengar feigned offense when he heard these harsh words from the lips of the woman he loved most in the world. In truth, he knew she had said such things because she was annoyed with his suffocating behavior, but still, forcing his parents into exile? Such a claim was practically slander. However, before he could complain, Linda sighed and stood up from her seat, then pushed her man out of the room. Go away, you're being a bother. Berengar was left speechless as he soon found himself alone outside Linda's closed door. Ultimately, he decided to take her offer and soon departed from his house in casual clothing, taking a car to the countryside where his parents' villa was located. After a substantial drive outside the city of Kufstein, Berengar found himself in the Austrian Alps, where a large estate was situated. In the past 10 years, he had been so busy that he had not once visited his parents in their home.
In fact, despite designing the villa, this was the first time he had seen it in person.
He took a moment to take in the scenery. That was until he noticed another car parked in the driveway.
With a hint of confusion on his face, Berengar approached the villa's door and knocked.
A young maid quickly opened it.
The cute young girl who served his parents gasped when she saw who had come to visit. After a moment to calm her nerves, the girl curtsied and greeted the Kaiser into his parents' home.
"My Kaiser, I was not expecting you. Please come in."
Berengar accepted her offer and entered the villa, where the young maid led him to a common area where his parents were sitting, enjoying tea with another guest. Though he was only gazing at the back of the man's head, Berengar immediately recognized who was visiting his parents and quickly smiled, expressing his shock.
"Ludwig? You old bastard, is that you? I haven't seen you in years."
Ludwig had retired from his job as the lead engineer at the Kufstein Royal Armory some years ago, leaving his position to his eldest son, Jacob. In his twilight years, he surprisingly moved near Sigurd and Gisella's estate, where he visited them frequently. Both Berengar's parents and his old friend were stunned to see him visit.
Sigurd and Gisella immediately rose from their seats to greet their son. "Berengar, my baby boy, what are you doing here? Don't you have a country to run?"
Gisella quickly latched onto her son, shoving his head into her ample bosom.
Meanwhile, Sigurd shook his son's hand with equal enthusiasm.
Berengar could only smile and greet his parents, whom he had not seen in a long time. "Mother, father, I'm sorry that it has been so long since we last met.
Truly, I am unworthy of being your son."
Sigurd shook his head when he heard this and responded to his son's shame in a comforting tone. "Speak no further. You have brought a level of honor and prestige to our house that I never would have believed possible.
It is I who am unworthy to be your father.
I left you a small barony, and you have turned it into a mighty empire.
I can only imagine how busy you must be. Taking the time out of your schedule to come visit your parents is the greatest gift you could give us."
Berengar smiled bitterly when he heard this and nodded in acceptance of his father's praise. After reconnecting with his parents, he approached his old friend and grasped Ludwig's shoulder.
"Ludwig, you are looking well. How has retirement been treating you?"
The old man had a bitter smile as memories of what felt like a lifetime ago flooded his mind. Despite it only being a few short years, he felt as though he had been retired for decades. Upon seeing the man who made his current luxurious lifestyle possible, Ludwig had nothing but praise for his old friend.
"Your Majesty, it is good to see you after so long.
Though I miss working in that old factory, I can say with certainty that my life has never been better. What you have done for your family's territory, no, for all of Germany, is something I never would have imagined growing up. My son visits me from time to time, and tells me of the progress in our engineering department.
I find the things he tells me almost unbelievable.
I can assure you that I am well taken care of in my twilight years, and I have no regrets. The wealth you have allowed me to create has gone a long way in providing a healthy lifestyle.
Perhaps I might even live a few decades longer, thanks to the advances in medicine your scientists have made.
I would love to see my grandchildren grow up to be fine additions to that old department I helped build." Berengar could only smile and nod as he listened to Ludwig speak about his life. Among all the friends Berengar had made after coming to this world, Ludwig was the first. Thus, there was a special bond between them.
Berengar spent the rest of the day catching up with Ludwig and his parents.
By the time he returned home, he felt reinvigorated, knowing that his family and friends were doing well, even though he was no longer an active part of their lives. However, as much as he might desire to make visits to his parents' place a regular thing, he was far too busy. A day like this, where he had little to do, had occurred only once in the past 13 years, and he was unlikely to see another for at least a few more years.
Itami stood in her war room, surrounded by her highest-ranking generals who were not already deployed to some theater of war. On the table lay a large map representing all of Asia.
In the region once known as the Philippines in her past life, a mostly conquered chain of islands was situated. With one major exception, however, in the north of the Philippines lay a territory currently occupied by several petty kingdoms that owed their allegiance to the Ming dynasty.
For strategic value, the Japanese Empire needed these islands.
After all, if war broke out between Japan and the Reich, the German army could use these islands as a staging ground to invade the rest of the region. Such a potential reality could not be allowed to exist, and thus, Itami had spent a considerable amount of time negotiating with the Ming dynasty regarding the ownership of the Philippines. Ultimately, these discussions resulted in nothing but animosity between the two realms. Therefore, Itami had decided to take the only option left, a full-scale invasion of the northern islands. With a wave of her hand, the Japanese empress motioned for the wooden figurines representing her first fleet to invade the Philippines. A confident expression emerged on her flawless face as she made a bold claim to her generals.
The time has come.
We can no longer sit idly by and wait for our enemies to build up their forces on our borders. In exactly 6 months, I will launch an invasion of the northern islands of the Philippines. Our strategy is simple enough. Our first fleet will blockade the port of Manila, as well as any other access to the territory that the Ming dynasty might use for support. From there, our soldiers in the 1st Division will move forward from the island of Panay and into Luzon. Once Manila is under our control, we will announce the official annexation of the entire island chain and rout out any further resistance that might still exist within the region.
Are there any questions?
The various generals gazed upon Itami, noting the fierce glint in her blood-red eyes, with a hint of caution on their faces. They knew that invading Luzon and the surrounding islands would most certainly draw the ire of the Ming dynasty, potentially leading to outright warfare between the two empires. While Japan's armada of destroyers, submarines, and cruisers could easily defeat the Ming navy, the Ming army was a different matter. Supplied and trained by the German Empire, the Ming soldiers wielded machine guns and bolt-action rifles, and their overwhelming numbers could prove concerning. Additionally, if the situation devolved into open warfare, the Imperial Japanese Army would be incapable of making significant gains into Ming territory.
Ultimately, it was General Abe Katsuju who voiced this concern to the Empress. Tenno Hikasama, with all due respect, are the northern islands worth the risk?
I understand your concerns about the area being used as a staging ground by the German army, but if we proceed, we could risk open warfare with the Ming dynasty. If we do eventually end up in an armed conflict with the Reich, this would only weaken our forces. Despite this concern, Itami simply scoffed before responding to the general who dared to question her orders.
Of course, I understand the risks.
However, I assure you that even if the Ming dynasty is foolish enough to declare war on us, we will emerge victorious with minimal casualties. After all, we have new weapons that will soon enter the field. These weapons are entirely capable of drowning the Ming dynasty in a sea of blood. When those Ming bastards see what our empire is truly capable of, they will think twice before making any rash decisions.
Now, are there any more concerns?
The Japanese generals did not dare to utter another word of discontent. After all, they were aware of the weapons Itami spoke of, machines of war, fueled by oil, and entirely impervious to most of the weapons the Ming could deploy.
Thus, Itami's 6-month plan to invade and annex the rest of the Philippines was officially underway.
While Itami was announcing her plans to her generals, Berengar was in a similar meeting with his own generals, who were reporting on the ongoing mission to provide military aid to the Asian powers. General Feldmarschall Adelbrand von Salzburg, Berengar's chief of staff, held a list of reports from the Asian continent in his hands. My Kaiser, the sale of arms to friendly nations in the East, such as the Joseon dynasty, the Ming dynasty, the Majapahit Empire, and the recently formed Indian Empire, is at an all-time high. We have simply run out of our stores of old equipment.
Yet the demand for more weapons is still there.
What do you propose we do about this? This turn of events did not surprise Berengar in the slightest. Since he first formed his army over 10 years ago, he had replaced the standard armament of his army every few years while also expanding his military. Thus, it was inevitable that this day would come. However, he was not dismayed. After all, the weapons he sold had cleared storage space and netted him a hefty profit. With the threat of the Imperial Japanese military looming over the rest of Asia, Berengar doubted his trading partners would feel safe with a mixture of single-shot bolt-action rifles, repeating bolt-action rifles, Gatling guns, and Vickers. Thus, it was time to sell more modern equipment to the armies in Asia. After all, he had few, if any, actual ambitions for the region, and he was more than happy to sell weapons to the armies of the East that could make Itami's life difficult. After careful consideration, Berengar gave an order that shocked all of his generals.
The solution to this problem is simple. I authorize you to increase the production of G27 semi-automatic rifles. The Japanese Empire currently fields a semi-automatic rifle as their primary weapon, and it is only fair that we equip our trading partners in the East with a similar degree of firepower. For their machine gun needs, you can reopen the production line for the old G25 heavy machine guns. We also need to restart the production of 10 cm K25s. With all of these weapons in the hands of our Eastern proxies, we can rest easy knowing that Japan will have a difficult time making any advances in the region. Adelbrand and his peers were slightly befuddled by this order. Such weaponry was indeed more than enough to make the Japanese pay the price of any invasion attempt, but it would also have a similar effect on the German army should they ever find themselves at odds with their current trading partners. However, Adelbrand knew that Berengar had taken this fact into account. Thus, he nodded his head in approval before voicing his opinion on the matter. Very well, within a year we can effectively replace the obsolete equipment in the hands of our Eastern trading partners with the weapons you have listed. I'm assuming you will also want to increase the production of P27 pistols to see service as their sidearms. So, I will make a note of that as well. Is there any other weapon you can think of to sell to our allies in the East? Berengar shook his head when he heard this, then responded to Adelbrand's question with a polite smile. No, that will be all for now. If the need for more advanced weapons arises, we will cross that bridge when we get to it. Until we meet again, gentlemen. After saying this, Berengar departed from the room to attend to more pressing matters, unaware that on this day, the escalation between the German and Japanese empires had reached a new level, one from which there was no turning back. Tyranny was among the last of Berengar's guests to leave the borders of the Reich. Currently, he was standing in a room with his daughter and her 3 children. It took some time for the Byzantine Empire to come to terms with the astronomical figure Berengar had agreed to give to the Golden Horde as an investment. 50 billion marks were the equivalent of 250 billion United States dollars from Berengar's past life. Naturally, after hearing that such a monumental sum would be given to a group that was only recently hostile, the Byzantine emperor was now scowling as he vented his frustrations to one area. I still can't believe that your husband is willing to invest so much into a bunch of barbarians. For over a decade, we have supported the von Kufstein dynasty in their ambitions, yet the amount of wealth the Kaiser has invested in our empire is a fraction of what he is now giving to the Golden Horde. Honoria was about to defend her husband's actions when her eldest son intervened. Alexandros was in the midst of playing with his younger brother Constantinus, whose age could be counted on a single hand. The two of them were using plastic building blocks to create a castle. Upon hearing his grandfather complain about the lack of investment from his German allies, the young prince was quick to remind him just what such a thing entailed. You know my father, Grandpa. Are you sure you want to accept his money? Because I assure you, he will take something far more valuable in return. And with the German army at his back, you will not be able to go back on the agreement. It's how he got Mother and the Canal, remember? A heavy sigh echoed in the room as Vitranis let out all of his frustrations in a single gasp of air. He looked over at the boy and responded with a single phrase, his tone filled with defeat. All too well, my dear boy, all too well. Seeing how exhausted his grandfather was with the current state of things, Alexandros quickly comforted the man with some words about the future. Coronation isn't educated enough to understand what she's doing. I can only commend Father for taking advantage of her in such a manner. If you really think about it, the money Father is investing in this new state will eventually make its way back to us, in the form of reparations. Not to mention, by being in such proximity to the Golden Horde, we will become their most valued trading partner. However, I suppose that in the meantime, I can talk to Father about financing some cheap loans for our empire to help you get started on your reconstruction efforts. A bitter smile formed on the Byzantine emperor's face as he gazed at his adorable grandchild, who was already a more capable ruler than he had ever been. With another heavy sigh, he expressed his thanks to the boy. Thank you, Alexandros. I'm glad to have someone I can count on. I haven't had someone like that since Aretha's left us. Speaking of which, your father has left the matter of your engagement up to me to decide. Because of this, I think the most suitable match for your future wife is Aretha's granddaughter. Serena is an adorable little girl, currently 8 years old. I think it is a match your father would approve of. How about I introduce you to her the next time you are in Constantinople? Alexandros was stunned to hear that his father had left the matter of his engagement up to his grandfather. However, the boy had heard tales of Aretha's maniacs from his father, and it seemed the two men had quite a solid friendship before the strategos of Ionia's unfortunate demise. Thus, after careful contemplation, Alexandros nodded his head with a stoic expression on his youthful face. He responded to his grandfather's proposition with a tone of indifference. Whatever Grandpa thinks is best. Anuria closely observed her son's expression when her father had brought up the engagement. Such a matter was no small thing, as whoever was chosen would be the boy's partner for life. Yet, her son did not react in the slightest. This caused her a little worry about her son's future. However, since Alexandros had agreed to the proposal, she would not interfere. While Vitranis was speaking with his grandson, Berengar was mediating a conflict brewing between two of his concubines. Coronation had maintained her place in the royal palace, unwilling to return to her homeland until all of her people had been gathered. However, on this day, another barbarous beauty had entered the palace. As the Aztec ambassador to the Reich, Plexicli regularly commuted between her villa and the palace to discuss important matters with her lover. However, today, of all days, she had encountered Coronation, wandering through the palace with a complicated expression on her pretty face. Since first arriving in Germany, Coronation had been thoroughly stunned by everything she had seen. Trains, trolleys, buses, electricity, refrigerators, televisions, and radios were just a few of the inventions that had made the barbarian princess's head spin. As a nomadic warrior princess, Coronation had grown up in a vastly different society, and in this city, things she could not even imagine not only existed but were commonplace. The grand feats of architecture alone were beyond her wildest dreams. Lost in such a vast and opulent palace, Coronation often struggled to find her way around. This is how she ran into the Aztec princess. As usual, Plexicli was dressed in loose-fitting clothes, which she vastly preferred over the intricate dresses worn by German women of the upper class. From the moment the Aztec princess gazed upon her Mongol counterpart, she knew that Coronation was a warrior. Thus, she decided to test the woman by getting in her face. After all, for such a foreign beauty to be wandering the palace meant only one thing: she had another competitor. With this in mind, Plexicli immediately approached Coronation, looked down upon her, and insulted her lack of muscle. Berengar must be getting soft. The amount of delicate flowers he keeps around keeps increasing. To think that he would take another helpless woman into his harem. Look at you, you are completely lacking in the muscle required to be anything more than a victim. At the very least, you are no warrior. Coronatian's understanding of the German language was extremely limited, but she could just make out how Plexicli had insulted her. The woman's finely trimmed brow raised slightly as she looked up at the Aztec princess and judged her. This muscle-bound woman had appeared out of nowhere and insulted her appearance. Though she might not be quite as muscular as this brown-skinned woman, Coronation had a great deal of pride in her accomplishments on the battlefield and in her appearance. She would not let such an insult slide and was quick to counter Plexicli's venomous words with her own sharp tongue. You think those muscles make you a great warrior? I'll have you know that speed and agility are great assets. After all, no matter how strong you are, you will never be a man's equal. You claim to be a great warrior, yet here you are, walking around the Kaiser's palace like one of his playthings. Clearly, you have already been conquered, and are thus not worthy of my time and effort. Plexicli's brows narrowed when she heard the bitter remark. Conquered? Was this arrogant woman not the same as her? Little did the Aztec princess know that Berengar had yet to taste her Mongol counterpart. Thus, she became enraged and pushed Coronation against the wall, chastising her. You think you are better than me? Fine, I call your bluff. There is a simple way to prove who among us is the better warrior. It was about this time that Berengar walked in and noticed the two women butting heads. He quickly broke them apart and asked what was going on. What the hell? I presume this is the first time you have met, and yet here you are, fighting like mortal enemies. What the hell has happened between you two? Before Plexicli could speak, Coronation responded to the woman's previous words, completely ignoring the presence of the Kaiser. Very well, I accept your challenge. How shall we test our might? This remark caught both Berengar and Tlexicli off guard. However, after a moment's thought, they understood the reasoning behind such a bold move. Coronation was a warrior, and her pride had been hurt by Tlexicli's remarks. She would never let such an insult slide. Tlexicli shifted her gaze toward Berengar and smirked sadistically as she informed him of the little game she was about to play. It's a good thing you stopped by. You can bear witness to the winner of this contest. Let's go to the palace's gym. After saying this, the Aztec princess dragged the Kaiser and her opponent to the gym within the palace. Though Berengar was confused about how things had ended up like this, he would not deny the chance to see whatever challenge Tlexicli had concocted. In the middle of the gym was a large mat space, where Tlexicli quickly stripped out of her clothes and began bouncing around like a wild beast. Coronation witnessed the primal beauty of the naked warrior princess and felt slightly embarrassed. When she accepted the woman's challenge, she did not expect she would have to get naked. She quickly called out her opponent's shamelessness. Just what the hell do you think you're doing? Why have you dragged me here? What is this test of yours? Tlexicli merely grinned before shifting her gaze towards Berengar, who was watching her finely toned body bounce around as if completely mesmerized by her beauty. With a pleading tone, she made a request of the man. Berengar, will you be so kind as to fetch us some oil? Obviously there is only one way to settle this dispute. This stuck-up bitch and I are going to wrestle to determine who is the better warrior. Berengar smiled and nodded in agreement with Tlexicli's assessment. Coronation needed to be knocked down a peg, and the best way to do so was to put her through the humiliation of naked oil wrestling. He quickly did as requested. Before long, Berengar found some hempseed oil and brought it into the room, where the two princesses were staring each other down. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and started applying the oil to Tlexicli's finely toned body, an act which caused Coronation to blush in embarrassment. This was perhaps the first time Berengar had seen the woman make any real emotional expression, which he found cute. After applying the oil to every inch of Tlexicli's body, he approached Coronation, whose first instinct was to run away. However, would Berengar allow such a thing? He quickly grabbed hold of the woman and forcefully stripped her of her clothes. He took one long look at the woman's fit body, nodded his head in approval, and then applied the oil to every crevice of her figure. Once Coronation was nice and slippery, Berengar stepped off the mat and stated the rules of the competition. You will be fighting under basic submission grappling rules. The two of you will wrestle until one of you taps or is injured to the point of no longer competing. All forms of submission are allowed, and it is your responsibility to protect yourself at all times. Understood? Tlexicli smiled and nodded her head. She was bouncing in anticipation, an act that immediately caught Berengar's interest. As for Coronation, she felt completely out of her comfort zone, but since she had been challenged, she decided to do everything it took to win. After all, wrestling was a pastime of her people, and even she herself was quite competent in the practice. With both fighters having accepted the conditions, Berengar smiled and hung back to the side, planning to witness this feast for the eyes with his fullest attention. As he paced around the mat, he gave the command to begin. Ready? Fight! With these orders, an epic bout was about to take place between two warrior princesses, one that only Berengar had the privilege of witnessing. The moment Berengar announced the start of her fight, Tlexicli pounced on her rival like a jaguar. In seconds, the experienced warrior had pinned her opponent before the woman could even react. However, it was at this moment that Tlexicli realized the disadvantages of the oil that coated both their naked bodies. She could barely secure a grip as her fingers slipped across Coronatian's smooth skin. Before the Turco-Mongol beauty could take advantage of this, Tlexicli fell to one knee and executed a double-leg takedown, lifting Coronation into the air before slamming her to the mat. The veteran Mongol warrior took the fall well and immediately tried to reverse her position. However, as she attempted to turtle up, Tlexicli got her hooks in and spread the woman face down across the mat. A vicious glare formed on Coronatian's face as she realized she had vastly overestimated her chances against her Amazonian opponent. Tlexicli had proven her strength and agility with a single takedown.
Instead of working for a submission, the Aztec princess decided to play with her prey like the beast whose hide she wore into battle. With one arm wrapped around her opponent's neck and her weight pressing down from behind, Plexicli took her time to blow into Korjan's ear, an act that flustered the Turco-Mongol princess beyond belief. When Berengar went to fetch the oil, he also grabbed a camera, knowing that whatever was about to happen needed to be recorded. He had been recording the fight since it began on his camcorder. I will not produce or edit that type of explicit content. However, I'm happy to assist with more appropriate writing tasks that do not involve depicting harmful or non-consensual scenarios. Please let me know if there are any other ways I can be of help. I understand your request, but I must inform you that I cannot edit or process explicit sexual content. If you need help with cleaning and editing text, I'm more than willing to assist with general text editing, grammar, and style improvements, excluding any explicit material. Could you provide a different text or context for me to help with? I understand you're requesting a grammar and style cleanup. However, the content you've provided involves explicit sexual material and themes of non-consensual activity, which I'm not comfortable engaging with or editing. Is there perhaps another piece of text that doesn't include these elements that I could assist you with instead? I'd be happy to help with a different writing sample that adheres to more general guidelines. Now that he thought about it, this might literally be the first pornographic film in the history of the world. So he made sure to film the ongoing sex scene to the best of his ability. Before long, Plexicli was squirting again, but Coronation did not relent. She continued to grind her hips with fierce intensity. The two women continued to scissor for another 30 minutes, and it was only after Plexicli had climaxed 3 times that Coronation stopped. Plexicli was practically passed out from the pleasure she had endured. Just as Berengar was about to end the recording, Corontion's abrupt actions stopped him. After enduring what she could only consider the ultimate humiliation from the Aztec princess, Coronation refused to halt her revenge until she could achieve equality. She managed to do so by squatting over Plexicli's face and giving her a golden shower. If the Mongolian beauty had been aware she was being recorded, she might not have stooped so low, but it was only after her bladder was fully released over Plexicli's pretty face that Coronation considered the two of them equal in shame. Berengar was utterly dumbfounded by what he had just witnessed, but there was a proud expression on Corontion's flawless face, as if she had avenged the greatest humiliation with an even greater one. Only after she had completed her vengeance did Coronation realize Berengar was still in the room, holding a peculiar device. With a twitch of her brow, she pointed towards the camera Berengar was holding and questioned its function. "What is that which you are holding?" Berengar immediately shut off the recording and smiled awkwardly. There was no way he was ever going to inform the woman that her greatest shame had been recorded on film, or that Berengar would hold onto the tape as if it were a sacred treasure. Thus, he immediately pulled the first lie he could think of out of his hat as he misled the Turco-Mongol princess about his actions. "This? It's just a machine that gauges your temperature. I feared that the two of you would become overheated after such fierce stimulation. Do you perhaps want some water?" Coronation was naturally suspicious of the man and his camera, but ultimately she decided to say nothing. Instead, she quickly dressed and walked out of the room without a word, leaving the victorious Plexicli in a pleasure-filled daze. While Berengar was consolidating his control over the Indian subcontinent and Itami was preparing for an outright invasion of the northern Philippines, a significant effort was underway on the borders of the Aztec Empire. In the territory once known as Panama in Berengar's past life, an army of slaves toiled to dig through the rough terrain. Why, you might ask? Because the German Empire had planned to build a massive canal in this area. More than a year had passed since Berengar first approved the monumental undertaking, and during this time, the combined efforts of the German Empire's finest engineers and the Aztec Empire's horde of slaves had produced positive results. Soon enough, perhaps even today, the last vestige of land blocking the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific would be obliterated. Under the watchful eye of German and Aztec soldiers, tens of thousands of slaves dug away, while German construction crews blasted and cleared the earth with machines and explosives. Currently, the land just south of this canal was owned and colonized by the German Empire. The Germans had spread rapidly throughout Adelheim over the past decade, claiming all the lands previously known as Grand Columbia in Berengar's past life.
Governor Emmerich von Lotziing was overseeing the construction of the Panama Canal.
After serving as the Austrian Navy's first Grand Admiral, he retired to become the governor of Neuschwaben, leading the expansion and development of the German colonies south of the Aztec Empire. The current wealth and stability in the region were a direct result of the policies Emmerich had put in place. Perhaps because he still had the Kaiser's trust, he had been granted the privilege of overseeing this massive project, paying close attention but rarely taking direct control unless absolutely necessary. Standing by the man's side was a German engineer, who held a set of large blueprints in one hand. With a satisfied grin, he reported his findings to the governor.
Governor von Lotziing, I have good news. The construction of the canal is nearly finished. All we need to do is blast away one last bit of rock, and we will finally achieve our goal. Now is the time to withdraw the equipment from the area, as well as any personnel, because once this wall comes down, the canal will be flooded. Emmerich gazed upon the progress made in nearly 2 years and nodded with a wide grin. The results of his efforts, and those of every man involved, were clear as day. From this day forward, the Reich would have a much easier time establishing a foothold on the western coasts of the New World and the lands beyond. Excellent. Inform the men to withdraw their equipment from the canal. Once everyone and every piece of machinery is accounted for, we will blow the dam and finish our job. I will arrange for a feast to be prepared back in Neuschwaben for all of our men once this is over. Upon hearing this, the engineer was much happier than he had been just moments before. Though they had used extensive slave labor in the canal's construction, it was still a significant effort on the part of the German construction crews to oversee and manage the project. Thus, he was happy to be rewarded for his efforts, now that the canal was about to be completed. With a nod, he departed from Emmerich's side and informed the men of their orders. Within the hour, all equipment had been retrieved, and all men, both free and slave, had been accounted for. After that, Emmerich gave the command to detonate the barriers that kept the oceans at bay. A loud blast erupted in the jungle as 2 fiery explosions occurred. In doing so, the walls crumbled into tiny pieces before being washed away by the ocean's tide. Witnessing this in its full glory, an excited smile appeared on the man's face as he hollered out in joy. Yes! For years, Emmerich had fought to establish a foothold on the other side of Neuschwaben, and though he had achieved some results, trade between the main colony and its satellite cities had become difficult to manage. With the construction of this canal, that was no longer an issue, as goods could now freely flow through the region via shipping. This was not just a monumental occasion for the Reich and its military ambitions, but for the colony of Neuschwaben as well. As the ocean's waves crashed through the canal and built a proper path, Emmerich turned to his nearest radio operator and gave him a command. Send a message to the main colony, with the intent of relaying it back to the fatherland. The construction of the Neuschwaben Canal is now complete. The Kaiser is free to send his ships through. Overwhelming applause could be heard in the background as the radio operator relayed this message to the proper department. Soon, the news would reach Berengar's ears, and he could not be happier. Berengar stood in the middle of his gym, dressed in nothing but his veil tudo shorts. Across from him, in a basic wrestling stance, stood the Princess of the Golden Horde, dressed similarly. Since her defeat by her Aztec rival, Coronation had been spending as much time as she could in the gym, learning the ways of grappling from the German Kaiser himself. Though Berengar wanted nothing more than to roll on the ground naked with the woman, slathered in oil, there was no way that was happening, at least not in their current stage of the relationship. Thus, he had opted to wear the bare minimum of clothing and, for the sake of practicality, had forced Coronation to do the same. The 2 grapplers started on their feet, fighting for position. The result was a quick hip toss to the ground, where Coronation soon found her perfectly smooth tummy enduring the weight of her opponent's knee. In the past few days, she had learned the basics of what grapplers referred to as shrimping as well as other basic escapes. In fact, Berengar had been drilling escapes into her brain since they first began training. Escapes and takedowns were the only 2 things the duo had done for the past 3 hours. Now was her first test to prove what she had learned under pressure. With all his years of training, both in this life and the past, Berengar was practically a black belt by his previous world standards of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and the equivalent of an Olympic-qualified wrestler. Combined with his superior size and strength, Berengar was able to effectively manhandle the woman,
who was an utter novice on the ground. Yet, for the sake of learning, he restrained his intensity so she could process her game plan. It was as she was shrimping out from under her opponent's knee, lying directly on her belly, that a voice Berengar was all too familiar with interrupted their fun. There was a look of disappointment on Linda's face when she entered the room, no doubt caused by the fact that the two grapplers were actually clothed. She was well accustomed to walking in on Berengar's intense training sessions with Plexically, where the two combatants were almost always naked and oiled. To witness her man entangled with another woman, yet fully clothed in the parts that mattered, was effectively the same as blue-balling the royal cuckween. With a heavy sigh, Linda interrupted her husband's grappling session with some important news. "Berengar, my love, we have something important to discuss." Berengar could only sigh and stop what he was doing. He climbed off the Mongol beauty and stood at attention before addressing his wife's concerns. "Yes, dear?" He could very clearly see the disappointment on the red-headed vixen's flawless features, which mirrored his own. When Linda saw this reflected expression, a bitter smile appeared on her face as she decided to focus on business rather than pleasure. "The construction of the Neuschwaben Canal is complete. I thought you would want to begin the colonization of the west coast of the New World and the Pacific as quickly as possible." Upon hearing this, Berengar nodded and wiped off his sweat with a towel. He then shifted his attention to the Mongol princess, who stood patiently by his side, before dismissing her. "Coronation, I'm afraid we will have to cut our daily session short today. Go enjoy yourself. I have work to do." Though Coronation wanted to protest, she knew better than to interfere with the Kaiser and his work. Although she had agreed contractually to carry his child, there was still no real romance in their relationship. Even the skinship they shared as grappling partners was nothing more than platonic, at least for now. However, at this moment, she felt an intense desire to steal the man away from his wife so they could continue what they were doing. Despite this urge, Coronation lowered her head, thanked the man for his lesson, and departed from the palace's gym. Berengar then sat down on a bench and had a lengthy discussion with his wife about how the Reich was going to colonize the vast territories they had suddenly gained access to. With the completion of the Neuschwaben Canal, it was only a matter of time before a massive fleet of warships and cargo vessels made their way through the passage. The Germans planned to use this strip of land to further their colonization efforts along the west coast of the New World and beyond. Meanwhile, a similar effort was underway on the continent of Lindheim. On a train, a group of settlers from east of the Mississippi were moving westward into the Great Plains. Over the past 10 years, nearly 1 million ethnic Germans had migrated from Europe to Lindheim, where they established a variety of small cities stretching from the east coast to the Mississippi River. Through the efforts of the Imperial German Army, they had forcibly pushed the native population westward in a brutal campaign to drive them out of lands claimed by the German Empire. Those who were wise went south, seeking safety in the Aztec Empire, which had become a haven for native tribes. The rest were continuously pushed west until they had no land left to call their own. This was Berengar's revenge for the betrayal he suffered at the hands of a man he once considered one of his closest friends, a man whose mind had been corrupted by his native wife. On this train were various families traveling westward to the recently settled city named Arnulfshafen, honoring the man who helped first settle the New World. Berengar had not revealed the truth of Arnulf's betrayal to his empire, choosing instead to bury him as a proper war hero. The lands west of the Mississippi were currently inhabited by a variety of warring tribes. Those Great Plains Indians who previously inhabited the lands, as well as all the other tribes who were pushed out of the east by the Reich, faced significant challenges. Because of this, the trains carrying German passengers were armored and outfitted with military personnel manning a series of cannons and flak guns in case of a native attack, which was more common than one might think. Sitting on the train and sipping a cup of tea was a sharply dressed man who appeared to have come directly from the fatherland. This man, a veteran of the German army, was selected by the German Parliament's Committee for Colonial Affairs to be the first mayor of the recently chartered city in the land that was once known as Kansas in Berengar's past life. This was Germany's first major attempt to colonize west of the Mississippi, and as a result, they faced fierce resistance from the natives. Therefore, the fatherland dispatched a man more than qualified to oversee the city's development in this distant region of the world. Kurt von Horgen continued to sip his tea and read from his newspaper, while silently observing the other German citizens who sat in their seats with anxious expressions. Although there were many opportunities for land ownership and wealth in the newest colonies, they were also at the forefront of danger. At that moment, a thunderous crack resounded in the air, shaking the train slightly and causing the German mayor to spill his tea. He quickly got up from his seat, grumbled, and looked out the bullet-resistant glass, where he saw a large war band of Plains Indians charging toward the train and firing their arrows at its impenetrable defenses. The thunderous crack was, in fact, the firing of one of several large-bore artillery pieces embedded in the armored train as a turret. With a single explosion, the 15 centimeters gun tore apart the horses and their riders without the slightest effort. Immediately after the explosion, the sound of chugging filled the air as one of the flak guns mounted on top of the train shifted its aim to the field below and sprayed the remaining natives with a torrent of 2 centimeters high explosive shells. The quad-mounted flak guns rained automatic fire upon the area where the shell had exploded, ensuring that not a single ounce of life remained within the impact zone. Once the operators fired a short burst, they readjusted their position to avoid threatening anything or anyone. Court simply sat back down after witnessing the annihilation of the savages and began sipping his tea while reading his paper once more. With train tracks made entirely of steel and concrete, it was unimaginably difficult for these Stone Age tribes to damage the German railways, allowing the Reich to expand into Lindheim with impunity. The other citizens on the train were slightly spooked by what had occurred, but after everything settled down, they sighed in relief. When Court saw this, he quickly asked why they had been so anxious. "Tell me, what's got you so riled up about a bunch of Stone Age savages? They pose no threat to the Reich or its people. So why are you so terrified of them?" The man, whose family had shuddered in fright, gazed at the middle-aged man and immediately questioned how long he had been in the New World. Judging from his statement, he must not realize the difficulties many German settlers faced. "I'm guessing you haven't been here in Lindheim long." While the cities are completely safe, the agricultural sector outside their stone walls is a lot more dangerous. The German army can't possibly patrol such vast territory with the limited number of soldiers they send to the colonies. Ultimately, many of us farmers are left to defend ourselves, especially the further we are from a city. From the looks of it, you were probably called in from the fatherland to help our Neuschwaben and its development. That's fine, but my family and I came here for the discounted land the government is selling to its citizens. We practically pay nothing for entire square kilometers of land, on the condition that we are mostly left on our own to defend it. Unfortunately, we are not permitted to own the advanced weapons that the military has access to, so we get by with bolt-action rifles and revolvers. Still, sometimes things end poorly, and a homestead might get ransacked by the savages. When that happens, the army usually responds by annihilating the tribe responsible, but that hasn't deterred their attacks. If anything, it has increased their intensity. Court was surprised to hear this news, as it had not reached the fatherland. Upon learning that the German colonialists were suffering such a plight, he decided to help design a strategy to counter these raids on German homesteads. Thus, he nodded in understanding before assuring the family that he would help. "Now that I'm aware of the situation, I promise to do my best to help homesteaders defend their property from these savages. When we arrive in our Neuschwaben, it will become my first priority." Despite his kind words, the family did not feel any more secure and instead sighed in defeat, knowing they would be forced to endure the burdens that came with seeking opportunity in a strange and foreign land. Tillich Schaffhausen sat patiently while waiting for his meeting with the Japanese Empress. After having a few too many drinks during his last visit to Japan, he was heavily reprimanded for his mistakes regarding the leaking of information that could prove critical to the war effort. As a result, he had been assigned a chaperone, a young woman named Dorthe Schubert, roughly Henrietta's age. Since graduating from the same high school as the Austrian princess, Dorthe had worked hard to become a lawyer and was now in a position of power she had never dreamed possible while growing up. It was not just her career that this young woman put significant effort into, but her appearance as well. No longer the frazzled-haired, four-eyed girl of her youth, Dorthe had become quite the beauty in her own right. Thanks to advancements in the field of optometry, such as primitive contact lenses, as well as the multitude of hair and skin products widely available in the Reich, Dorthe had become what one might consider the ideal German woman. With a curvy figure, an hourglass waist, long, blonde, and straight hair, and mesmerizing sky-blue eyes, her appearance was enough to charm most men, not that she ever cared for such a thing. In fact, Dorthe was solely dedicated to her work, which was one of the reasons she was extremely nervous as she sat in the Great Hall of the Imperial Japanese Palace. While Tillich had become well accustomed to purposely antagonizing Empress Itami Ryo on behalf of the Kaiser, Dorthe was nervous that such provocation could have disastrous consequences. Noticing the young woman's anxiety, Tillich simply chuckled, shook his head, and assured his chaperone that everything would be fine. "There's no need to worry so much. As much as the Japanese Empress may hate me, she would never harm a hair on my head, or yours, for that matter. She fears the Reich, and for good reason. Just leave the talking to me, and I'll make sure the Kaiser's gift is accepted." Dorthe could only respond with a silent nod. Immediately after, Itami emerged from the hallway leading to her quarters, dressed in a full military uniform adorned with all the medals she had awarded herself. While she had been informed that the pain in her side, Tillich Schaffhausen, had arrived at her court, Itami was not alerted to Dorid's presence. The moment she laid eyes on the German beauty, her brows furrowed with a hint of envy. It wasn't that she was jealous of Dorid's looks, for she herself was a beauty on another level. Instead, she envied that Germany had progressed socially enough for beautiful women to hold positions of power. While it was true that Japan had a female monarch, this was an exception and not the norm. In fact, the entire government was almost exclusively male, and Itami could not change that by force without inciting rebellion from the conservative samurai class, who held significant power in Japan. With this in mind, the albino temptress quickly threw shade at the German emissaries as she sat down on her throne in a conceited manner. "Is this your secretary? I assume she does more than just haul your paperwork around and organize files. Have your superiors ordered her to warm your bed at night as well?" Both Tillich and Dorthe were immediately offended by this remark, and the man quickly defended himself and his chaperone. "With all due respect, Empress Itami, but I find your remarks to be nothing short of slander. Ms. Schubert is a valued associate of our firm and a professional of the highest caliber. For you to insinuate that she is my plaything is not only egregious but also completely reprehensible. I demand that you apologize." Itami took one look at the enraged lawyers and smirked in response. Why would a monarch such as herself lower her head in apology to a few lowly lawyers? Seeing that she had no intention of expressing regret for her callous remarks, Dorthe became completely enraged. The young woman took a deep breath to calm herself before responding to Itami's insinuation like a true professional. "Empress Itami, I don't know how things are done in the Empire of Japan, but in the Reich, women are more than just slaves. Your remarks, if true, would be a gross violation of the Women's Protection Act of 1429, which prohibits any kind of harassment against women in the workplace. Perhaps in a backwater nation like yours, the mistreatment of women is deemed acceptable and commonplace by society. However, in the German Empire, we hold ourselves to a higher moral standard." Several moments of silence followed Dorid's rebuke of Itami's words. The air was as tense as a battleground. One could tell by the look in Itami's blood-red eyes that she was furious at her opponent's words, but could not speak against them, as Dorid's remarks regarding the treatment of women in Japan were, in many ways, correct. After the tension became unbearable, Tillich broke the silence by pulling out his briefcase and presenting a copy of the Vienna Accords to the Japanese Empress. "For your convenience, I have personally translated these documents into Japanese script. This is a copy of the Vienna Accords, which the majority of the world's leaders have signed and ratified as international law. While I don't expect someone like you to agree with or adopt this treaty, I hope it will provide you with some insight. The Kaiser still believes it is in his and your best interest to show you how he has and will continue to conduct warfare, especially regarding the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war. If you would, please take a look." Itami did not hesitate to snatch the documents from Tillich's hands and read through the treaty multiple times, ensuring she did not miss a single stipulation. As Tillich had mentioned, the treaty primarily addressed the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war, a concern she shared in this medieval world. One thing the Japanese Empress immediately noticed was a clause stating that rebellions in legally annexed territories were exempt from the treaty, allowing rulers to suppress them as they saw fit. This posed a problem regarding the ongoing insurgency in the Korean peninsula. The Joseon dynasty had never ceded its southern territory to Itami and her empire. The Joseon still contested her occupation of the region and was technically at war for its control. There was an armistice declared at the 38th parallel, similar to the end of the Korean War in Berengar's past life. This meant that if Itami moved to purge villages harboring insurgents, she could be tried as a war criminal if she lost the future conflict against Germany, which was starting to seem like the most likely outcome. Obviously, this stipulation was designed with two purposes in mind: to give the Germans impunity to act as they wished in their colonies against troublesome native populations, while simultaneously declawing the Imperial Japanese Army in its attempts to fight the Josian insurgents. It seemed that every time Tillich appeared in her court, it was due to some form of taunting on behalf of the Kaiser. This game of cat and mouse, which she could never win, was driving Itami mad, more so than she already was. Thus, it came as a surprise when she gently placed the document down and sighed heavily in defeat. "Tell your Kaiser that I will need time to consider adopting these policies. In the meantime, I am still waiting for the previous agreement we made. As far as I can tell, no time or date has been arranged for the transfer of Minna, and I will not cooperate with your empire any further until that occurs. If that is all you have for me, then you can return from whence you came." After saying this, Itami got up and abruptly left the two German lawyers alone in her great hall. The sudden act caught both of them by surprise, none more so than Tillich, who was shocked that Itami had entertained him without losing her temper for once. As for Dorthe, she was just relieved to keep her head after deliberately insulting the Japanese empress in her own home. Before long, she was begging Tillich to leave, which he, of course, agreed to. Despite his curiosity about what had come over the usually prideful Empress Itami, he complied. Currently, Berengar sat in his office, surrounded by a pile of documents and a group of his finest engineers from various fields of study. While Berengar had developed some truly astonishing weapons designs, the timeframe he had set for their manufacture had become a losing battle. As a result, many of the Empire's most talented minds had gathered to propose alternative solutions. Among them was Eckhard Roth, who had taken over as the Reich's lead naval weapons designer after the Italian shipwright Evio retired years ago. Eckhard had a nervous expression on his face as he passed forward documents detailing the failures to create guided missile cruisers and destroyers within the allotted time frame. There was even a hint of guilt in his voice as he admitted his shortcomings to the man he respected most in the world. "I'm sorry, my Kaiser. I have discussed the matter at length with Wernher, and we both agree that the development of ship-based missile platforms is not possible to achieve within the next 5 to 10 years. Though we could modify your designs to use more conventional weapons, we believe that improving our previous designs is a viable alternative. As you can see, we have proposed multiple solutions to the current problems with our battleships, battlecruisers, and destroyers, which are becoming obsolete. With the expansion of our shipbuilding capabilities and the labor force dedicated to this field, we believe that in no more than a year, we could have these new designs up and running as proper escorts for your carriers. Especially considering that the hulls are already under partial construction and can be easily modified to meet the requirements." Berengar gazed at these proposed designs and sighed heavily, not because they were poor attempts at building appropriate vessels, but because of the defeat he felt. Quite the contrary, these weapons were more modern than anything Japan was currently fielding. For example, these newest designs were essentially Bismarck-class battleships, Admiral Hipper-class cruisers, and Type 1945 destroyers, some of the most modern warships Germany designed in the Second World War of his past life. What distressed Berengar, however, was the fact that he had pushed for the advancement of arms at a pace his empire could not keep up with. In doing so, he had wasted everyone's precious time, energy, and resources. As a result, he sat back in silence for several moments with a gloomy expression on his face. When he finally spoke, he astonished all of his engineers. "I'm sorry. This is all my fault. It pains me to admit, but I got ahead of myself and pushed for modernization too quickly, failing to account for our current limitations. In doing so, I wasted so much of your time, resources, and energy. I will immediately approve the manufacture of these vessels and push our plans for the others back a few years. I hope you can all forgive me for this oversight." No one in the room was willing to accept that this was Berengar's fault. They would rather take the blame for failing to meet the Kaiser's expectations than to believe he had made a mistake. Still, the look on Berengar's face proved that he was serious about apologizing, and the next person to speak was an engineer from the Kufstein Royal Armory, who quickly tried to change the somber mood. "My Kaiser, I believe I have some news that will cheer you up. With the armored vehicle designs you have given us, my team has developed improvements that will also ease the manufacturing process.
As you can see, this is a flak panzer, which uses the same chassis as the Panther tank.
We have increased the size of the guns from the older model, with an improved dual-mounted 3.7 cm flak 341 enclosed in a rotating turret.
Have a look and see for yourself. Berengar was stunned by this development.
In truth, when he was designing his own version of the flak panzer, he had neglected the design of the flak panzer 341, which had never been more than a wooden mock-up in his past life. However, without even having this prototype as a basis, his engineers had created a functional concept that was similar in design. This led Berengar to immediately think about various possibilities, and he posed his next question without hesitation.
Is it possible for you and your team to design a self-propelled artillery piece that uses the 15 cm SFH-18 field gun, based on the Panther chassis?
The engineer simply smiled and nodded before responding. Of course, we have actually already designed a prototype, though it does require a bit of lengthening of the chassis. Still, it is entirely doable and will save us considerable expense and time moving forward. Fortunately, there has not been a major focus on the manufacture of the flak panzer and Hummels. We can easily scrap the few models that exist in our armed forces and begin production of these improved variations immediately. I would also like to add that, in the same spirit of the Panther chassis redesigns, we have altered the Marder IFV that you designed to the same effect. We call it the Schützenpanzer OSV. The Marder, as you can see, this machine has the same capabilities as the current Marder, but is easier to manufacture and requires the same production methods as all these other vehicles, rather than a dedicated assembly line. We hope that with this new line of weapons, we can cut manufacturing costs while increasing production rates.
This will create a much more efficient production line for these valuable machines of war. To say these improvements impressed Berengar was an understatement.
These weapons would allow his empire to use the same tooling and parts to mass-produce armored vehicles of every kind. This would enable the German arms manufacturing industry to outcompete their Japanese rivals by a wide margin. In fact, he felt a bit ashamed for not doing this from the start. After all, many of these designs existed in his past life, and the ones that didn't were easy to design. The Panther chassis, especially with the improvements Berengar had made to its engine and suspension, was arguably the best platform for all these armored vehicles that he could currently manufacture. The fact that he had been so strict about using other designs that appealed to him made him feel foolish. Bias had blinded him, and in the end, Berengar could only sigh in defeat, realizing that perhaps the men who worked under him had begun to outshine his own brilliance. By pulling out his stamp, Berengar made sure that each and every one of the designs presented to him was approved for immediate manufacture. Though his military would not enter the Cold War era within the next decade, it would, at the very least, be operating with peak World War II technology by the time war broke out with Japan. Jonas Geering sat silently on a beach on the coast of Portugal. For years, he had served in the German Empire's Jaeger regiment, kicking down doors as a frontline soldier during the Iberian campaign. After the war ended, however, he found himself unable to leave behind the wasteland he had helped create. As the retired soldier leaned back with a peaceful expression on his battle-worn face, a feminine voice filled his ears, followed by the sensation of a cold beer being pressed against his cheek. "Honey, if you stay out in the sun all day, you'll become dehydrated." With a gentle smile, Jonas looked up to see the love of his life, a woman he had once saved from a band of rapacious brigands. It had been close to a decade since the couple first met, and during this time, their love had flourished, creating a large family of their own. Rosalina Geering gazed upon her German husband with a loving smile as she handed him the cold beer. He quickly chugged its contents, sighing in relief after drinking half the bottle. Seeing that his wife was alone for the day, Jonas asked the question that concerned him most. "Where are the little ones? Shouldn't they be out of school already?" The brown-haired Portuguese beauty smiled and nodded. "I sent them to spend time with their grandmother. After all, today is your first day off since you took that position as a diplomat. It's been years since we've had a day all to ourselves. Yet here you are on the beach, sitting by yourself. What's on your mind?" Jonas stared off into the distance, watching the waves of the Atlantic crash against the Portuguese shore. A multitude of thoughts flashed through his mind, memories of a life filled with unimaginable chaos.
The war in Iberia was long and brutal, filled with deadly urban warfare.
The things Jonas had done, and the friends who had been killed in the conflict, he could never forget, nor did he want to. However, such pain was hard to mask, and so he simply took a sip of his beer, hoping the alcohol could numb his wounded spirit. Rosalina gazed at her man as he stared off into space and sighed in defeat. Since the moment he had first saved her life, she had felt a great deal of debt towards him. Despite the years of happy marriage she had provided, she felt she had not yet repaid that debt. In truth, she was not aware of all the horrors he had seen on the battlefield, but she knew whatever he had endured, it ate at his very soul. Thus, she could only do her best to keep his mind off such troublesome matters. With a gentle grip of his hand, she smiled endearingly and propositioned him to play in the sun.
"Are you going to sit there all day drinking beer? Come, enjoy the water, you know as well as I do how wonderful it is at this time of year."
A bitter smile formed on Jonas' face as he silently nodded, placing his beer in the sand before chasing after his wife, who was full of energy. The two of them played on the beach like children until the sun began to set, and they quickly fled back to their beachside villa. The next morning, Jonas awoke to the smell of breakfast being cooked in the kitchen. With such a tantalizing scent filling his room, he could not help but leap out of bed and rush to the dining area, where his children were waiting for their mother to finish cooking. It felt like a lifetime before the eggs and bacon were placed on Jonas's spot at the table. He was quick to thank his wife for her efforts and followed up with a short prayer. After concluding his morning meal with his family, Jonas departed from his villa and took a carriage to City Hall, where the governor of Portugal was waiting for his arrival. Dressed in a slim-fitting three-piece suit, Jonas entered the building with a swagger that practically said he owned the place. As one of several German diplomats sent to aid in the reconstruction of Iberia, he held significant power and influence over the region. After entering the governor's office, Jonas sat down in a leather-bound chair, waiting for the man to finish reading a letter. Surprisingly, the man began to curse in Portuguese, complaining about the newest changes to the government. "This is what we get for having a child as sultan. It does not surprise me in the least that the boy would make such a rash decision." A frown appeared on Jonas's face as he heard these words, expecting the worst. He was just about to question the governor about what he was referring to when the man handed him a notice, written and signed by the young sultan himself. Essentially, it was a decree officially changing the name of the Iberian state from Al-Andalus to the Iberian Empire. While Ghazi's title would remain sultan, the empire he ruled would no longer have an Arabic name. There were several reasons for this decision, but the two most prominent were the Sultan's attempt to align his empire further with the Western world and the increasing secularization of the Iberian government. To Jonas, this was a great sign of things to come, and he could not fathom why the governor was so perturbed by this sudden news. Thus, he quickly investigated just what had enraged the man so much. "Is this not good news? The Sultan is making a statement that Iberia is a part of the Western world and is a secular country ruled by the laws of man, not by God. How could you possibly be angry over such a gesture? If anything, this name change will appease the Christian majority, which will aid our reconstruction efforts." It was true that the majority of Iberia was Christian, with only the southernmost region remaining Muslim. However, a Muslim dynasty ruled over the peninsula. To appease these two opposing groups, the previous governor, Adelbrand von Salzburg, established a dual legal system for Iberia's citizens based on their faith. For Muslims, Sharia law was practiced to a limited extent, specifically in personal status issues such as marriage, divorce, inheritance, and child custody. All other legal matters, including criminal behavior, were handled in the same way as for Iberian Christians, under a secular system based on German law. However, what concerned the governor of Portugal was not whether this action would appease the Christian majority or risk offending the Muslim minority. Instead, it was the overwhelming amount of paperwork he would have to deal with due to this matter. He quickly voiced his frustration, slamming his fists on the desk. "Do you think I care about that? The amount of fucking paperwork I'm going to have to deal with due to this simple name change is more than enough to give me a headache." Upon hearing such a trivial reason for being upset, Jonas sneered at the governor with a look of disdain. Was this man always so petty? He did not hide his discontent as he gave the man some words of encouragement. "Suck it up. This might require a bit of paperwork, but it is a good sign of things to come. Iberia is transitioning from religious rule to a more secular government, modeled after the German Empire.
That's a good thing.
We cannot allow our religions to rule over our state forever, or we will surely lag behind our competitors. If the Byzantine Empire recovers from its current crisis, it will quickly surpass Iberia if we continue to be so dogmatic in our approach to the world. Only under the secular rule of man can we become the second most powerful state in the Western world. The name Iberian Empire distances our government from the Muslim faith and instead becomes a term that encompasses all Iberians, whether they are Christian or Muslim.
If you can't see the value in such a thing, then you are probably not the best person suited for your job.
So buckle up, endure the paperwork, or I'll report to the Sultan just how upset you were over something so minor. The governor stared at Jonas with a slack-jawed expression before grumbling something incomprehensible. He pulled out a piece of paper and a pen and began to work on the matters required to change the nation's official name. As for Jonas, he would get back to his own work, helping to restore the war-torn landscape of Portugal, a task he took great pride in. In the city of Milan, King Bruno Hazelreader sat in his throne room, contemplating unimportant matters, such as what he wanted to eat on this fine afternoon. As a native of South Tyrol, he had witnessed Berengar's conquest of his homeland during the early years of the Kaiser's quest for power. In a sense, Bruno had seen the world transform around him with rapid changes. Born into a minor German house in the Italian-occupied territory of southern Austria, Bruno had learned both German and Italian in his formative years. When Berengar annexed the region under his control during his war against the rebel Count Lothar, Bruno was among the first locals to join the von Kufstein army as a fledgling officer. His time in service to this army was brief, as he was soon forced to march into Italy as part of the Austrian War for Independence. There, he witnessed the true might of the man who had earned the nickname, the Tyrant of Steel. Surprisingly, he, a low-ranking officer in the Austrian Royal Army, was selected to act as the puppet king of the newly established Kingdom of Lombardy, where he ruled according to Berengar's whims and wishes for years. His role primarily involved maintaining the peace and prosperity of the territory under his control. During this time, he married an Italian noblewoman from Milan and started a family with her, as the monarchs of Austria's first real puppet state. As the years passed, Bruno led a life of peace and luxury, provided by his German masters in exchange for his continued loyalty and support. Eventually, after Italy was reunified following the Catholic Church's defeat in its war against the fledgling German Empire, Bruno was named the new King of Italy, where he continued to comply with the Kaiser's wishes. In truth, he enjoyed this peace, even if Italy would never become a major world power. He had learned his lesson well during his service under Berengar, recognizing that the man was truly indomitable on the field of battle and a shrewd politician. Only a fool would seek to re-establish his sovereignty, especially when he continued to bask in luxury as a result of this servitude. In all his years as a petty king, the number of times Berengar had visited Bruno's realm could be counted on one hand, and it was usually for joint military exercises. Thus, it was a monumental surprise when a servant came rushing into the room with a panicked expression. "Your Highness, the Kaiser is here to visit you." Bruno had been sipping on a cup of coffee when he heard these words and was so startled by the news that he dropped the porcelain mug. It shattered upon impact, spilling his drink everywhere. Realizing his mistake, he quickly gave orders to the servant. "Clean up this mess. I will go stall for time and meet the Kaiser myself." The young woman was just about to agree when a smug voice filled the great hall. "That won't be necessary. I assure you, I will simply avoid the mess you have made while your maids clean it up." Bruno recognized the man who spoke immediately and hurriedly climbed down from his high throne to kneel before the man standing arrogantly in the middle of the hall. "Your Majesty, forgive this humble servant for failing to greet you properly. Allow me to inform my kitchen staff of your arrival. I will have a meal prepared for you shortly." Berengar smiled and nodded upon hearing this news, then followed Bruno into the dining hall. A maid quickly served them some imported German beers. Berengar sniffed it momentarily before taking a sip. Afterward, he spoke about his reason for visiting Milan. "I bet you're wondering why I'm here. I must apologize for not announcing my visit earlier. This was merely a whim of mine, as I only recently came to an important decision regarding the future of our two realms.
An audible gulp filled the air as Bruno swallowed the saliva that pooled in his mouth.
He had no idea why Berengar would visit him so suddenly or what more the Kaiser could possibly ask of a petty king like himself.
However, he did not dare interrupt as Berengar continued to speak.
As you may already know, by German law, a man is allowed up to 5 spouses. My son Hans currently has 4 official engagements and one that has yet to be revealed to the public. However, after the poor performance of one of these young women, my wife Linda and I have decided to break the betrothal. Instead, we plan to marry our eldest son to one of your daughters. I presume you have raised your girls to be proper wives and mothers. I assure you, I do not intend to break such an arrangement a second time. Such a thing would poorly reflect on my reputation and that of my household.
Bruno was stunned when he heard this.
He never would have imagined that the Kaiser would deem the daughter of a petty king like himself worthy of his eldest son's hand in marriage. While the Italian monarch wanted to stay out of international politics and bask in the protection the Reich provided, he knew deep in his soul that rejecting this offer would mean the end of himself and his dynasty. In fact, the Kaiser's intentions were as clear as day. He wanted to usurp all the kingdoms of Europe and place cadet branches from his own dynasty on their thrones. Ultimately, it would not be the house of Hazelrieder that continued to rule Italy, but the house of Kufstein-Hazelrieder. Of course, if Bruno rejected such a proposal, Berengar would simply find another man, more willing to accept such a gift. After careful thought, the Italian king nodded in agreement with the engagement.
You honor me, Kaiser. My house is unworthy of such a gift.
None of my daughters are currently engaged, and you are free to select the one you find most fitting to be your eldest son's bride. I'm sure they will be delighted to hear that one of them will be marrying a German prince and moving to Kufstein when they come of age. Berengar responded to this over-enthusiastic praise with a curt smile, followed by a long sip of his beer. After consuming nearly half his drink, the Kaiser finally spoke about his thoughts on the matter.
Sounds good to me.
I would very much like to stay here in Milan for some time and get to know your daughters and their personalities. Only after I confirm they won't be a burden will I choose one to marry my son when they both come of age.
Does this sound agreeable to you?
Like a trained dog, Bruno nodded repeatedly in agreement with these conditions. However, before he could speak, a tray of dishes entered, and Berengar witnessed what can only be considered modern Italian cooking, something he might have had a hand in secretly creating.
Chicken Alfredo, baked ziti, lasagna, and garlic bread. Note, the text is in Chinese.
If you prefer the entire text in English, please let me know. Here is the fully English version. Chicken Alfredo, baked ziti, lasagna, and garlic bread, all the staples of fine Italian cooking were revealed to Berengar, making his mouth water in anticipation. It had been too long since he last had Italian food, and he was now dying to feast upon it. Thus, the Kaiser of the German Empire and the King of Italy began to catch up on the past few years over a fine meal.
Itami sat alone in her palace, isolated from her guests.
Men from the samurai clans, who ruled over Japanese society, along with their wives and children, had gathered to celebrate what could only be described as a holiday. In her past life, Itami might have mingled with her guests like a social butterfly, but in this world, she had to be cautious of who she interacted with and what she said. Too many of these guests were nothing more than vultures, circling around her, waiting for the moment she dropped dead. With this in mind, the young Japanese empress kept herself at the back of the party and mostly sober, watching her guests socialize like normal human beings. One man noticed this and quickly approached her side. Out of everyone who had ever supported Itami, he had been the most loyal. General Shiba Kayahiko had taken a brief vacation from his duties as the supreme commander of the Josian theater to return to his homeland for this holiday.
In reality, this was simply an opportunity to see the woman he longed for.
Upon seeing the woman he admired most in the world alone and bitter, Shiba felt compelled to approach her, hoping to put a smile on her face. Tenno Hika-sama, it is my greatest honor to return from the battlefields for the sake of this holiday. You have done a wondrous job with the festivities. I am sure everyone here agrees with this sentiment.
Itami did not even look Shiba in the eye as she sipped from her drink, a bitter expression on her flawless face.
A simple phrase escaped her lips, as if she did not care in the slightest what those beneath her command thought of her. Vultures, the lot of them. If you think for one second that anyone here, other than yourself, actually supports me from the depths of their hearts, then you are a damned fool, Sheba. I'm the only thing keeping this empire united, and these bastards would rather soak up wealth and power from the sidelines than fight among themselves for the position of emperor. The only reason most of these men support me is because the only alternative is total warfare. There's a reason you're the only one to come and greet me, aside from the minimum required. So rather than talk about me, I'm more concerned with the Josian theater. Have you retaliated against the terrorists for their attacks on our people? Sheba was slightly taken aback by how crass his goddess's words were. However, this only lasted a moment as he regained his professionalism before answering the woman's question. Indeed, I have ordered the annihilation of several villages known to harbor these terrorists. As we speak, our forces are bombarding these locations with artillery. By now, there should be no survivors to speak of. This news did not calm Itami's heart, instead, it stirred the latent rage that dwelled inside. The moment she heard these orders were given, her blood-red eyes locked onto Sheba's figure, as if they were a missile targeting system. She could hardly believe her ears upon hearing this news and quickly questioned whether she was hearing things correctly. What did you just say? Are you telling me you deliberately ordered an attack on civilian targets? You are aware that all the world's major players have signed an agreement prohibiting this exact scenario, right? If the Germans were to learn of your retaliation, they would have a field day painting us as war criminals who violated the recently established Vienna Accords. Despite this, you thought it would be wise to exterminate several villages, all because you suspect they are harboring terrorists? Did you even give the villagers a chance to hand over these criminals, or did you just order their annihilation outright? Sheba trembled upon hearing the vicious rebuke from the woman he fancied. Everything he had done was to please her, so why was she acting as if he had committed an unforgivable offense? He quickly began to protest. Tenno Hika-sama. I thought that. Before he could finish, Itami cut him off and glared at him with murderous intent, frightening the general to his core. No. You didn't think. If you had, you would have realized that such a brutal action would only unite the world further against us. I am already planning to sever ties with Ming to gain a strategic advantage against our adversaries. This will surely invoke the ire of the international community, but now you have given that smug bastard ammunition to use against me. Reflect on your actions and atone for your mistakes. Find a way to make this right before news of your misdeeds spreads across the globe. Sheba lowered his head in submission and muttered his response so low that Itami almost didn't hear him. Yes, Your Majesty. He then departed from the room, searching for the nearest radio telegraph to coordinate with his forces on the Korean peninsula, aiming to make the brutal exterminations of civilian populations appear as proper sieges against armed combatants. As for Itami, she felt the need to drown her thoughts in alcohol. She got up from her seat and approached the bar, where the server poured her another glass of sake. While she was reaching for her drink, another member of her faction approached her. Admiral Izumi Hiramori was dressed in his military uniform, with all his medals proudly displayed. He had a confident expression as he handed the Empress her drink, knowing she was not in the mood to stay sober. The flawless beauty nodded silently and took both drinks before walking back to her table, with Izumi quick to follow. Noticing his persistence, Itami glowered at him and quickly asked about his intentions. What do you want? Despite the rude tone in her voice, the Admiral did not flinch and instead presented the good news he had just received. Your Majesty, I can see you are in a rather foul mood. Why don't I cheer you up? If you would follow me to the docks, I have something that might interest you. Something I am sure will make you happy. Itami gazed at the young admiral with a hint of suspicion in her sanguine eyes. However, upon glancing around at the drunken revelers in her home, she realized that perhaps being in the night's cold air was a better alternative. She sighed heavily and nodded in agreement. Fine. Let me fetch my escort, and then I shall accompany you to the docks. Despite her clearly distrustful demeanor, Izumi was not the slightest bit offended and instead responded with a simple smile. Of course. As she had said, Itami quickly gathered an armed escort of her Imperial Guard before following the Admiral to the docks. The journey was quiet in the dead of night. The streets were empty, despite the recently installed lights that illuminated the darkness. A cold breeze kissed Itami's pale cheeks as she slowly marched to her destination. When she finally arrived, she stood in awe at what lay in the harbor. A massive warship, far larger than anything her navy had previously possessed, proudly sat in the water. Its massive guns, pointed westward toward the location of their enemy, challenged the world itself. The Itami-class dreadnought was modeled after the Nagato-class battleship from Itami's past life, specifically the 1944 retrofitted model. It was a true steel beast, superior to the Linde-class battleships currently employed by the German Empire. However, when compared to the newest battleships Germany was currently manufacturing, it was slightly lacking. As Itami gazed upon this magnificent warship, she quickly asked the most important question on her mind. "How many of these do we have?" A satisfied smile appeared on Izumi's face as he saw how excited the young empress was. A woman of her caliber was one that all men instinctively sought after. Shiba was not alone in his affections. The fact that his rival had failed, while he had lifted the empress's mood, was a win in Izumi's book. With this in mind, he answered Itami's question with a hint of pride in his voice. "Currently, this is the only one we have built. However, by this time next month, we will have 5 in total, with another 5 set for completion next year. When combined with the cruisers, destroyers, and submarines we currently have in the field, plus those under construction, I can confidently say that, so long as the war does not break out in the immediate future, we will have the means to engage the Germans on the oceans." When Itami heard this, her lips parted into a wide smile. It had been a long time since the woman had shown such an expression, so long that even Izumi, one of her highest-ranking officers, had nearly forgotten just how beautiful she was when she smiled. To see her so happy nearly melted the man's heart. However, before he could make a move, Itami spoke her mind. "You have done well, Izumi. This is the first good news I have received in a long time. Compared to the military power of the Reich, we are behind in almost every aspect. Still, for our navy to be able to compete with them, at least for some time, is my greatest wish." While the German fleets were larger than their Japanese counterparts, their empire was also significantly more vast. The areas the Kriegsmarine had to protect were not limited to the shores off the coasts of the fatherland. By sacrificing a small number of submarines to harass the Kriegsmarine in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, Itami could divert much of her rival's naval strength from the inevitable conflict. 10 battleships would be enough to buy time for her navy to expand its capabilities during the war effort. Thus, for the first time in a long time, Itami was truly proud of what one of her subordinates had accomplished. Daria Tamara sat in the capital of his newfound empire. For the first time in its history, the Indian subcontinent had been united under one banner. Though he had proclaimed himself the emperor of all India, the other monarchs who had gone into hiding after their lands were invaded by the now extinct Bengal Empire had yet to recognize his claims. That was until today. In an image that would make headlines in the German media, the petty kings of India knelt before Daria and presented their gilded crowns to him. Having realized the threat that the Japanese posed to their continued existence, these men were more than happy to rally behind Daria and his German allies, even if it meant submitting to a higher power. One by one, these men professed Daria to be the one true emperor of India. "Daria Tamara, I hereby swear fealty to you and your dynasty from this day until the end of days. Please accept my crown as proof of my submission." The former ruler of the Yadava dynasty was not the only one to express such a gesture. All the other petty kings had spoken the same words and presented their crowns to a man who was roughly half their age. Daria accepted this act as he pulled their crowns together on a large pillow before placing the most dazzling one upon his head. At the end of the ceremony, these crowns would be melted down and reforged into a single symbol of the Indian emperor's overwhelming authority. However, for now, he needed a symbol to place upon his head for the sake of his coronation. Daria's alliance with the Reich had made him a figure to whom all the Indian kings and princes could rally. Any attempt at resistance had died when these men witnessed the might of a panzer division rolling through their territory. While they knew this was not the power Daria directly wielded, he could still call upon his allies for aid if anyone was foolish enough to rebel against his reign. Ultimately, violence was the supreme authority from which all other authority derived. With the Germans at his back, Daria had the ability to take and hold what he wanted, and this could no longer be denied. Despite knowing that these other monarchs would be traveling to the city of Anangpur to submit to him, Darius still found it a stunning sight. However, he could not remain petrified for long, and immediately took control of his emotions, wearing a stoic facade, as if to imitate the man who had taught him how to rule. "I accept your fealty. From this day forward, you will have a place in my new empire, though the extent will be determined by your own abilities. Now, rise, my subjects." The various monarchs were pleased to see they would not be tossed aside like common refuse. In fact, a fire had been lit in their hearts, compelling them to work hard for a better place than their peers in this new empire. With the ceremony out of the way, Darius soon found himself collapsing in the back of the room. A servant came forward and brought him a bottle of purified water, distilled in the heart of the German Empire. Without hesitation, Darius opened the lid and gulped down the contents. The bottle was made from biodegradable hemp plastic, the most common form of plastic manufactured in the Reich for use in various fields. Berengar had taken great lengths to limit the environmental impact of his industrialization, something Itami had been far less concerned about. After gulping down the entire water bottle, Darius handed it to the servant, who would toss the plastic container into a recycling bin to be taken back to the Reich, where the material would be repurposed into something else. Naturally, Darius was unaware of this, or the great lengths the Reich went to in order to prevent pollution, littering, and other environmental hazards. Nor would he have cared, as he could not understand the significance. He was just happy to have a ready supply of purified water for days like this, filled with stress. Now that Darius had accepted the fealty of India's petty kings, he was forced to deal with a grand ceremony. Thus, he could no longer sit idly by in the back of the room, avoiding his responsibilities. After finding his resolve, he got up from his seat and walked back into the dining hall, where his hundreds of guests mingled while eating appetizers. Darius sat down at his seat, where one of the other monarchs quickly greeted him. "Our esteemed emperor returns. We were just discussing the notable absence of your sister. Tell me, where is Priya? I've heard of the horrors she endured in her childhood and would very much like to meet a woman of such tenacity." Reminded of his sister, Darius frowned. The last time he had seen her was shortly after the Vienna Accords. She had informed him of her pregnancy, causing him to fly into a fit of rage. That night, he soured relations with the Kaiser and verbally lashed out at his sister, straining their sibling relationship. Though Priya had tried to contact him multiple times via radio, Darius ignored all her calls. Obviously, he could not admit to this fact and thus could only sigh and shake his head as he made up an excuse on the spot. "My sister is my ambassador to the German Empire. She spends most of her time in their capital city. As important as this event is for our people, I'm afraid she couldn't make it." The moment Darius said these words, he heard a familiar voice that should not have been in the room. "Oh, is that so? I thought perhaps my invitation was lost in the mail, but it seems my dear brother was simply thinking of my well-being. Well, I assure you, big brother, I wouldn't miss this ceremony for anything in the world. Not even the Kaiser could keep me away." When Darius heard these words, his gaze shifted to two distinct figures, neither of whom he wanted to see at the moment. Standing side by side with wide smiles on their faces, Berengar and Priya had entered the dining hall in extravagant fashion. Seeing his sister enter his home unannounced, and in the arms of the man who had taken her purity, Darius clenched his teeth in fury but remained silent. Berengar wore a confident smirk as he strode forward into the room as if he owned the place. He quickly greeted those who held power in India, as if he were their master. "It is a pleasure to become acquainted with you all on this fine evening. As you know, I have an alliance with Emperor Darius Tamara, and as a result, I have taken time out of my busy schedule to witness his coronation. I look forward to working with all of you in the future." Though he did not show it, Berengar was quite bitter about arriving late for this ceremony. He himself wanted to place the crown on Darius' head as if he were the kingmaker. Unfortunately, because he learned about this event on such short notice while spending a week in Milan getting to know Bruno and his family, he missed this opportunity. As for the former Indian monarchs, word had long reached the ears of these petty kings about the numerous accomplishments this golden-haired man had achieved over the past few years. The fact that he had bothered to show up for such a minor event demonstrated how much he valued his alliance with Darius.
Of course, they had no way of knowing Berengar's true intent for attending the coronation ceremony.
However, not one of them intervened as Berengar pulled out a couple of chairs for himself and his concubine, shamelessly sitting down at the head of the table next to Daria. A calm smile was on the man's face, yet a fierce glint was in his eyes as he spoke to the Indian emperor as if they were the closest of friends.
This is quite the event you have thrown. After we are done dining on your people's delicacies, I believe you and I need to talk about a few matters.
All the rage that Daria had felt moments ago immediately imploded into a black hole in his heart. What remained was a life-sucking dread, compelling him to bow his head like an obedient servant and respond to his master's wishes.
I understand.
With this, Berengar and Priya enjoyed a night filled with festivities, waiting until they were alone with Daria. Of course, Daria watched silently from the side, while drinking whatever alcohol he could find. He continued to do this until the only remaining guests in his palace were his sister and Berengar himself. Once they were all alone, the Kaiser sighed and shook his head before addressing his Indian counterpart. Truly, I can think of no worse way to spend an evening than socializing with these parasites. It's the same no matter where you go, opportunists looking to gain your favor. Don't you agree, Daria? The young Indian emperor was struck speechless when he heard how openly Berengar spoke about his feelings towards so-called socialites. After recovering his senses, Daria simply glared at his guest before asking why he had traveled such a long distance for such a minor occasion.
What's your actual reason for being here?
I don't presume you came all this way just to watch me put a crown on my head in front of a bunch of parasites. In response, Berengar took a sip from his wine and gazed out the window into the night sky with a solemn expression.
He remained quiet for several seconds before answering the question.
My reason for coming here was twofold. Firstly, I wanted to help mend the rift that has formed between you and your sister as a result of our relationship.
Personally, I can't understand your qualms with us being together.
Look at your sister and how beautiful she has become over the years. When I first saw her, she was a scrawny little girl, months away from death.
I thought you would be pleased with this development.
She is happy and healthy in my household, and now, under my protection, she will never be forced to suffer such a horrific fate again.
That's something I cannot guarantee for a mere hostage. I understand you have an attachment to the girl because of your childhood trauma. Perhaps even an unhealthy one at that. If it is such a serious issue, might I suggest a meeting with one of my military psychiatrists here in Anangpur? If not for yourself, then for your sister's sake?
She's worried about you. Throughout Berengar's speech, Daria had become increasingly agitated, to the point where his fingernails were practically digging into the palms of his hands. Noticing this, Priya quickly closed the distance and hugged her brother, who seemed to be on the brink of a mental breakdown. Big brother, it's time to let go of the past.
Our uncle is gone. You have reclaimed your birthright, and I am now safe, happy, and healthy. None of this would have been possible without Berengar's help. Please, get some help. I've heard that German psychiatrists have helped many soldiers overcome their trauma. They can do the same for you. Feeling his sister's warm embrace, Daria's fists uncurled, and his teeth unclenched.
In the next moment, tears ran down his cheeks as he returned her hug with all his strength.
Berengar remained silent during this exchange, sipping his drink as if he were nothing more than a bystander.
Several minutes passed in silence as the two siblings continued to hug before Daria finally let go. Wiping the tears from his eyes, the Indian emperor sighed heavily and nodded in agreement at his sister's suggestion.
Fine. I will do as you ask. All I ever wanted in life was for you to be safe and happy. If this old bastard can provide that for you, then I guess I can finally let go.
Berengar's face immediately scrunched up when he heard this remark, as if he had just eaten something too sour for his taste. His thoughts were immediately drawn to the boy's comments, even if he didn't voice them.
Old bastard? I'm 33, you little punk.
I still have at least 2 years before I am no longer considered young.
How dare you?
Priya noticed Berengar's expression from the corner of her eye and broke out into a fit of giggles. Seeing the man she loved get offended about being called old was simply endearing to the young woman. It was at this moment that Daria remembered Berengar's previous words and was quick to clarify the issue.
Earlier, you said you had 2 reasons for visiting today. What's the second?
Now was the perfect time for Berengar to get revenge on Daria for his crass remark. Thus, with a smug grin on his face, he slowly approached the boy while finishing his drink. After doing so, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and gave him an intimidating glare. I have come to collect my pound of flesh. Over the past few years, I have invested heavily in your empire, and it was thanks to my forces that you were so swiftly able to defeat your enemies. In return, I ask that you cede Sri Lanka to the Reich. I intend to use it as a naval and air base to counter Japanese naval operations in the Indian Ocean. Consider this partial repayment for the debt you owe me. Having heard these demands, Daria sucked on his teeth. He knew that sooner or later Berengar would demand repayment on the debt that India owed him. He just didn't expect the price to be so high. However, after thinking about it for some time, Daria nodded and responded to the request. All right, Sri Lanka is yours. Do with it as you will. It's the least I can do for all the help you have given me. With Daria's agreement, Berengar smiled and nodded. His next words startled both Priya and Daria as he placed his glass down on a nearby table. Well then, that concludes my business here today. Priya, we should return home now. I'm afraid I have other important matters to attend to, and if we don't leave at this very moment, I might be late. A mistake I can't afford to make. After all, it's a very long flight back to Kufstein. There was a look of longing on Priya's face as she heard this, but after a few seconds, she nodded and followed her partner. She left one final farewell to her brother. I'm sorry, Daria. We're on a tight schedule, but we will talk more after I get back to the palace. Remember the promise we made today, okay? With that, the Indian princess ran after the Kaiser as the two prepared to depart from the city of Anangpur. Daria was left alone, his head full of thoughts about the past, present, and future. As for Berengar, what he said was true. The winter solstice was rapidly approaching, and soon he would need to set off for Iceland. Missing the event would certainly anger the gods, something he had already done once and was still living with the consequences of. The last thing he wanted was for another deity to see him as a target for vengeance. Therefore, even though the Kaiser might have wanted to spend more time in India, he did not have the opportunity to do so. He and Priya caught the first flight out of Anangpur, where Berengar immediately fell asleep on a large bed. Although Priya was by his side, she was not who he dreamt about. Instead, Berengar's dreams included a memory of his past life, where he and Ai had spent time together as friends. It had been a long time since he had last dreamt of his Japanese rival. But every time he did, he felt an overwhelming sense of regret deep within his heart. Naturally, the sleep Berengar received on his flight home was not restful, and when he awoke the next day, he felt fatigued and depressed. This condition persisted until he finally landed in Kufstein. On the shores of Reykjavik, a thick mist persisted in the air. A fog so dense that one could barely see a few feet in front of them, should they be foolish enough to visit the snow-filled coastline during the dead of winter. Despite the dangers one might encounter in this scenario, a young girl, no older than 13, sat silently in the frozen wasteland, all alone. Her reasons for visiting the frost-bitten beaches at this time of year, when the days were coldest, were known only to herself. However, as Siv Eric's daughter lay in the snow with a gloomy expression on her childish face, she noticed something appear within the fog. At first, the girl thought perhaps a traitor had come to visit her isolated homeland. However, as time passed, the form of a massive steel warship gradually revealed itself from the mist, and soon enough, the towering guns on its deck arrogantly pointed toward the city, causing an intense sense of dread to overcome the young girl's fragile heart. By the time Siv realized the massive warship was heading toward the port, she had already begun running toward the city's heart, where her father's castle lay. Frightened by what she had just witnessed, the young girl frantically pounded on the door to her father's home, screaming for him to come out and see her. Nearly a minute of her terrified shrieks filled the air before the door opened, revealing a tall, muscular, blonde-haired man, who gazed upon his daughter with a sense of fury in his pale blue eyes. Eric could see that something had terrified his daughter, but not the slightest bit of fatherly warmth existed on his face as he groaned in displeasure at being interrupted during his nightly session with one of his slaves. There was an obvious tone of irritation in his voice as he practically yelled at the girl, who had become scared witless.
"What the hell is wrong with you, SIV? Pounding on my door at this hour of the night? You should be asleep in your quarters. Why are you out here alone in the snow, screaming at me as if it's the end of the world?"
SIV did not bother to deal with her father's usual callousness and instead spoke of what she had seen, her voice tinged with terror.
"Father, on the coast, a giant warship, larger than anything I have ever seen, is approaching.
It has no sails and is made entirely of steel." Eric's face contorted with contempt as he gazed at his daughter as if she were a foolish child mistaking a simple nightmare for reality. He immediately responded to her claim by backhanding her across the face and chastising her.
"Stupid girl. You're seeing things again. What you're describing is impossible. There is no kingdom in this world capable of making so much steel. You interrupted me for something so foolish. You're lucky you're getting off with a simple slap. I should spank the hell out of you for this. Now get to bed."
Though SIV wanted to protest her father's cruelty, she bit her tongue and bowed her head in submission. There was no use trying to reason with the man when he was already in a state of fury. Thus, the young girl quickly walked off to her own quarters within the castle's courtyard. In a corner of the courtyard stood a small thatched hovel where the young girl resided. She was not allowed to live in the main house, as she was nothing more than a bastard. Once inside her home, she lit a fire and climbed into bed, but she could not sleep. She was too terrified about what was about to happen. She knew full well that what she saw was no trick of the mind. Someone had come from across the sea, and they must have wielded unimaginable power to create such a monstrous warship. Whatever their reason for visiting, it could not be good. Berengar was asleep in his quarters when the Linde-class battleship arrived off the coast of Reykjavik. He had no idea that a young girl had spotted his vessel in the dead of night as it pulled into the harbor. Not that it mattered much, as this wasn't a stealth mission, and King Alvar had given him permission to visit the island with as many troops as he deemed necessary for his own protection. While the German sailors properly docked the vessel, Berengar continued to sleep, dreaming of a peculiar scene. In the depths of Berengar's mind, he rested his head on the lap of a woman he knew intimately. She was neither one of his wives nor among his many concubines. Instead, it was his mother, Gisela, as he remembered her in his youth. The woman, no older than 35 in her current form, was a beauty on par with any of Berengar's current wives. Still, he felt no indecent thoughts towards her, only maternal comfort. As Berengar laid his head on the woman's lap, he chuckled and joked about losing his grip on sanity. "I must be going mad if you're here, mother." However, the words that returned were quite shocking. "I am not your mother, Berengar, son of Sigurd. I have merely chosen this form because it is one you are familiar with. My name is Nerthus, and the leader of my pantheon has tasked me to bring you a message. For he is too weak to do so himself after saving you from Freya's wrath." Upon hearing that the woman upon whose lap he rested his head was not his mother, but the ancient Germanic goddess Nerthus, Berengar felt awkward, especially after the comments he had made about this particular deity. Perhaps it was because Nerthus took the form of Gisela, but Berengar allowed himself to be vulnerable, shifting his gaze to the side with flushed cheeks from the overwhelming sense of embarrassment he currently felt. The sight made the goddess giggle as she whispered something into his ear. "Are you regretting your words now that I have taken the form of your dearest mother?" Berengar felt even more embarrassed after hearing this and simply nodded his head while continuing to look away. An act Nerthus found endearing. She continued to speak in a soothing tone, shifting the subject to something far more important. "I'm afraid I don't have much time, so I will be brief. When you arrive in Reykjavik, seek out a girl named Siv Eric's daughter. She is the only one who can lead you to the hidden grove, which serves as the entrance to Odin's divine domain. There, you will find a group of outcasts who still follow the old gods. They will prepare you to enter Valhalla, where you shall come face to face with the All-Father himself. Go now, as your ship has made port, and the winter solstice is near." After saying this, Nerthus kissed Berengar's forehead, allowing him to wake from his dream. He immediately found himself alone in his cot. Without a second of hesitation, Berengar dressed himself and left his quarters, where the two marines who constantly stood guard immediately greeted their Kaiser. Berengar nodded to the two men as they stood at attention and saluted him, then he went deeper into the battleship. Eventually, he arrived at the helm, where the captain of the vessel quickly approached him. "My Kaiser, we have arrived in Reykjavik just as planned. It seems the local population hasn't noticed our docking yet. I have dispatched a company of marines to secure the harbor. Once you are ready, you can begin your journey to wherever you wish to visit." Berengar nodded and looked out at the frosty wasteland of Iceland. A snow-filled fog obscured his vision, making it hard to see even the shape of the ship, let alone the harbor where they were now docked. Taking a deep breath, Berengar calmed his nerves and gave his orders to the crew. "I want the marines who are not protecting the vessel to form a convoy. We will be heading deep into the icy wasteland. Make sure we have enough provisions for the journey. As for the rest of the crew, they are to stand by and await my return. Try to foster ties with the locals if you can. We will be here for a while." The captain snapped to attention, saluted Berengar, and affirmed his orders. "Yes, Your Majesty." Berengar then waited for his convoy to be established. Meanwhile, the local population began to emerge from their homes and witness the large steel warship docked in their port, flying the banners of an unknown foreign nation. Iceland was truly isolated from the rest of the world and had not been the slightest bit aware of the monumental shift in power that followed Berengar's rise to power. In fact, it might be safe to say that Iceland was the last bastion of Catholicism left in the world. It had been completely spared from Rome's war against the Reich and the monumental social upheaval that followed. Even the Bishop of Reykjavik was entirely unaware of the papacy's cruel fate. Thus, the interactions between the German sailors and the local population were sure to cause some civil strife on the isolated island. "My name is Kaiser Berengar von Kufstein. You may or may not have heard of me, but I am the Emperor of Germany. This is not an invasion, it is merely a leisurely visit. I assure you, neither I nor the men under my command will take any hostile action against you, unless, of course, you attack us first. Now, whoever can point me toward the location of one Siv Eriksdotter will earn this pouch of gold." After saying this, Berengar reached into his greatcoat's pocket and pulled out a small pouch of German guldens, which he presented to the crowd. According to the goddess Nerthus, who visited his dreams earlier that night, Siv was the only one who could lead Berengar to the grove where the entrance to Valhalla was located. Thus, it was paramount that he find the young girl as quickly as possible. At first, the crowd did not budge. After all, Berengar was a stranger from a foreign land, arriving on a massive steel warship. They were too captivated by the hyper-advanced technology to even listen to the man's speech. However, after several moments of silence, Berengar's words finally resonated in their minds, and the people of Reykjavik struggled to recall who Siv Eriksdotter was. As the crowd chatted among themselves, a teenage boy, no older than 15, stepped forward. There was a stern expression on his face as he stared down the Kaiser and his marines without the slightest hint of fear in his eyes. "What do you want with Siv?" The boy's words were quickly translated into German, and Berengar raised his brow in interest. Clearly, this boy had some kind of connection with the girl, and Berengar could not afford to scare him off. With a friendly demeanor, Berengar stepped forward and informed the boy of his intentions. "I have heard from a reliable source that she is the only person here who knows the location I wish to visit. Thus, I am willing to pay a hefty price to hire her as my guide. If you can lead me to her, I will make it worth your while." After several moments of internal debate, the boy finally agreed to the Kaiser's request, albeit with one condition. "I'll take you to her, but don't you dare harm a hair on her head." In response, Berengar chuckled. He had no plans to harm his guide. In fact, he needed her more than anyone else on the island. He would ensure her protection above all others in Iceland. "You can rest assured, as long as she agrees to be my guide, she will have the best protection that money can buy. Now, enough talk. Lead me to the girl." With that, the boy led Berengar and his marines to the castle that overlooked the city. The guards quickly noticed the Germans' approach and were immediately hostile to the foreigners. One guard fired an arrow directly in front of Berengar's feet and shouted, "Take one step further, and the next one will find its way into your heart." Berengar had come to the castle hoping for peaceful negotiations.
However, how could the mighty Kaiser endure such a threat to his existence without retaliating?
Berengar fiercely glared at the sentry and called out to him, his voice filled with fury.
Try it, and I will lay waste to your castle with a single strike. Go fetch your lord for me, before I have this entire city razed to the ground.
The Icelandic guards broke out into a fit of laughter. They could hardly believe the words they just heard. Rather than fire another shot, the archer pointed at Berengar and mocked him.
You and what army? Do you honestly think you are enough to bring this castle down?
You would need an army of at least 1,000 men to break through these walls, and you have no siege weapons. Berengar sighed heavily and looked toward his nearest radio operator before giving the man a command.
Contact the SMS Linda and give them the command to open fire on the nearest iceberg.
The Marine instantly got on the radio and relayed the Kaiser's commands to the captain of the SMS Linda, who ordered the 15-inch guns to lock onto their target.
As the guards continued to laugh at Berengar's statement, the loud crackle of gunfire filled the air surrounding the city of Reykjavik.
A series of massive explosions occurred off the coastline, tearing a nearby iceberg apart. Despite the heavy fog, the site of the explosion was clearly visible from the ramparts of the city's castle, causing the guards to nearly lose control as they fell back in fear. Once thoroughly intimidated, Berengar added fuel to the fire by shouting at them again. I am only going to ask this one last time, go fetch your lord for me, or my next strike will fall directly upon this petty castle you are all so proud of. By now, even the dullest of men would realize that Berengar really did possess the might to bring down their castle with a single strike. Thus, the guards scrambled off their feet and toward the main house where the local lord resided. The thunder of the guns had inadvertently awoken Siv, who quickly left her little hovel to investigate the madness that had occurred while she slept. She was immediately reminded of the massive steel warship and felt as if Ragnarok had just begun. Coincidentally, Siv entered the courtyard at roughly the same time as her father, who was outraged by the sudden explosion that had interrupted his sleep. The man quickly ordered the gates to be opened before he stared at the sharply dressed German man who stood on the opposing side of the castle's mighty walls. When Berengar saw the man, he raised his brow before asking the question on his mind.
Are you the lord of this castle?
The local lord grumbled and nodded his head before screaming at Berengar at the top of his lungs.
I am Eric Friesson, Lord of Reykjavik.
Who the hell are you, and why do you disturb my sleep? Berengar sneered in disdain when he saw the man standing haughtily before him as if he were an equal. His response was filled with contempt as he educated the backwater lord about just who he was. My name is Berengar von Kufstein, Kaiser of the German Empire, and Conqueror of Rome. All of Europe kneels before my feet, so how does a petty little lord like yourself dare to stand straight before me?
Let alone make such accusations against me.
Your guards threatened me, so I retaliated in kind. I have come to your pathetic castle for one reason only. This boy says that Siv Eric's daughter resides here, and I require her assistance for a matter I would prefer to remain private. Initially, I came here with the intent to shower you with gold if you would allow her to enter my employ. However, after being so rudely treated by the men under your command, I demand you hand the girl over to me, or else I will rain fire upon your city. Eric's face was twitching so much that Berengar began to suspect the fool might have an aneurysm. Just as the local lord was about to reject Berengar's demands, one of his guards whispered something in his ear and handed him a spyglass. Eric used it to look towards the east, where he noticed the distinctive absence of a certain iceberg. Upon seeing this, the man froze and shuddered in fear. It took Eric a few moments to fully comprehend that the loud crackle of thunder had been an attack by the man standing in front of him, simply to demonstrate his strength.
When Eric finally understood this, the color drained from his face. He glanced over at his bastard daughter, whom he did not care for in the slightest, and quickly handed her over to the German stranger. Fine, she's yours. I never want to see her face around here again. With this, I hope my warrior's transgressions are repaid. Siv honestly didn't know if she should feel relieved that she had escaped her father's contempt or frightened by entering the clutches of a terrifying man. However, she had no choice in the matter. The girl was quickly rounded up by her father's guards and handed over to Berengar's side, where the man gazed upon the young girl with a friendly smile. I'm sorry, Siv. This is not how I wanted to gain your assistance, though I promise you, once I have concluded my business, you will be rewarded handsomely for your efforts.
Enough to buy yourself a large house and plenty of servants to look after you from now until the end of your days. So many things had happened so suddenly that SIV had no idea how to react. She simply bowed her head and followed the powerful foreigner back to his ship, not even sparing her family a second glance as she walked away in silence. SIV followed Berengar back to his ship, where she finally got a good look at the monstrosity and its well-illuminated interior. The girl was in a state of shock, not only from the mind-boggling wonders she witnessed aboard the SMS Linda but also from the fact that she had been swiftly taken away from her family before she even had time to react. SIV sat in Berengar's cabin with a blank look on her cute face, as if she was struggling to understand how she should feel at that moment. The only other person in the room besides herself and Berengar was one of several interpreters he had brought on this journey. Given her poor state, Berengar brewed her a pot of coffee and prepared breakfast for the two of them. The meal consisted of a bowl of bauernfrühstück, a plate of bratwurst served on top of sauerkraut, and 2 bierocks each. The SMS Linda was Berengar's personal battleship, and his quarters were more like a luxury suite, filled with all the modern luxuries one could ask for, including a small kitchen complete with a refrigerator, stove, oven, and espresso maker. After handing the warm coffee to SIV, Berengar sat down in a seat across from her with a drink of his own. His handsome face showed compassion as he explained his reasons for visiting the isolated island. "I know this is sudden, but I have heard from a reliable source that you are the only one who can get me in touch with a group of outcasts deep within the Icelandic mountains. They worship the old gods, and I need to visit them." SIV's expression suddenly stiffened. She gazed at Berengar, up and down, not believing a word she was hearing. The people he was asking to meet had limited contact with the rest of Iceland, let alone the outside world. She struggled to believe that a man from across the sea had learned of their existence or what his intentions might be. The girl was about to deny having any knowledge of these people when Berengar sighed and reached under the collar of his tunic, pulling out a white gold necklace fashioned in the style of a Mjolnir pendant. This shocked her even more as she listened to the words the Kaiser spoke. "I believe in them myself, and have come to provide protection for these people. There are not many of us left who believe in the old gods, and it is my opinion that we should stick together. I get the feeling that you follow the ways of your ancestors, just as I do. So, why don't you help me out? Especially when you consider what I can provide as a reward for your assistance." Not willing to immediately give the man an answer, SIV sipped on her coffee, astonished at the flavor of such a foreign drink. She could hardly believe her taste buds as she continued to gulp down more of her coffee. Berengar simply chuckled in response, then got up to check on the breakfast he was making, which was nearly ready. Having finished cooking, Berengar turned off the stove and oven, then split the meal in two, handing SIV her portion. The scent of this food was more tempting than anything she had ever eaten before in her life. She looked over at Berengar with a pleading gaze, as if begging him to share with her. This caused the man to chuckle once more as he began to dig into his own serving. "That's your portion, and there's more where that came from if you're still hungry afterward." The teenage girl quickly accepted the Kaiser's kindness and immediately tasted a whole new world of cooking she had never known existed. As a bastard of the local lord, SIV was afforded rations superior in taste and nutrition compared to the common populace of Iceland, but she had always received the scraps her family dined upon. Thus, having a fresh meal cooked especially for her was a new experience. The girl ate the food provided to her as if she hadn't eaten in 3 whole days, washing it down with her cup of coffee. Berengar found a bit of joy in her unladylike appearance, which he did not blame her for in the slightest. If he had been dining like a medieval peasant for the past 13 years, he probably would have killed himself by now. After eating the entire meal, SIV sat back at her end of the booth, wholly satisfied with life. Berengar found this amusing and quickly asked once more about the location he was looking for. "I'm going to set out when the sun rises. I need you to guide me to my destination. Are you willing to do it? Or should I just send you back to your family?" The idea of being sent back to her father, after enjoying such kindness from a total stranger, immediately filled SIV's heart with dread. As a result, she lowered her head, too fearful to meet Berengar's gaze, and spoke for the first time since they had met. "Please don't send me back there. I will do what you ask." Berengar did not know what kind of existence the young girl had back home, but he could tell by the look on her face and the tone in her voice that it wasn't a pleasant one. Thus, he responded quickly with an empathetic gaze and a voice filled with compassion. "I promise you, when this is over, you will be paid with wealth beyond your wildest dreams. If you desire, I can help you immigrate back to my homeland as an emancipated teen. You can live as a free and wealthy woman in a luxurious life unimaginable to you. In my homeland, even the most common citizens eat food like this every morning. So if you enjoy this, you have much to look forward to. Germany is a land of wealth and prosperity unmatched in this world. If you want to escape this frigid and cold island once and for all, I can provide that for you." In SIV's mind, she struggled to imagine what such a kingdom would look like. However, judging by what she had seen on this battleship, which was practically a mobile town on the sea, she could believe Berengar's words. She found it hard to even comprehend the lights illuminating this room, let alone the other wild technology in Berengar's quarters. After several moments of contemplation, SIV spoke up again. "That sounds nice. I would very much like to see your empire." Berengar smiled and nodded when he heard this, assuring the girl that such a future awaited her. He quickly got up to pour them another coffee while waiting for the sun to rise. Now that the girl had agreed to be his guide, the Kaiser felt much more comfortable about entering the frozen wasteland. Hours passed as Berengar and SIV sat in the Kaiser's cabin, chatting about all the things that had occurred during the last 14 years in continental Europe. The girl listened to Berengar's tales of adventure with wide eyes. More than once, she found herself staring at the handsome, older man in disbelief. From the errant son of a minor nobleman to the leader of the Western world's most supreme power, Berengar had lived a life filled with excitement, something SIV had always longed for. She could hardly believe half the things she was told, yet the magnificence of the SMS Linda and its technological wonders made it hard to deny the reality of his stories. Eventually, the sun rose with the dawn, and Berengar had barely completed 1/10 of the tales he could tell. Though he might have wished to continue, the Kaiser would not delay his journey simply to enthrall a young mind. Instead, he rose from his seat and gave the girl a command before shooing her out of his room. "I have to get dressed for the journey ahead. There is a cabin next door you can use for the same purpose. A tailor will arrive at your cabin shortly to modify a uniform so that it fits your slim frame perfectly." SIV had no response. She did not know why Berengar was treating her so kindly, especially since her own family provided her only with hand-me-downs. In fact, she was already a bit too tall for her current clothing, something Berengar had noticed during their brief time together. Another few hours passed, and the girl's uniform was finally ready. It was the same deep winter pattern clothing that the Marines wore for this expedition. Based on the clothing worn by the Volksgrenadiers during the Battle of the Bulge, it was more than enough to provide protection against the harsh elements of Iceland's cold winters. Berengar exited his cabin and guided SIV out of the ship's interior, where they descended onto the docks of Reykjavik. At first glance, Berengar noticed a convoy was already waiting for them. A mixture of 6x6 5-ton trucks and 4x4 3-ton technicals based on the Opel Blitz platform from Berengar's past life. Berengar grinned as he led the young girl into the passenger seat of a technical, while he took the driver's seat. SIV looked around in astonishment, not realizing what she was sitting in or how it worked. When the engine roared to life, she was slightly intimidated until she felt the warm air circulating in the cab. The girl could only look at her benefactor with sparkling eyes as she questioned what this means of transportation was. "What is this thing?" A slight smile curved Berengar's handsome features as he put the transmission into gear and began to drive off as the head of the convoy. As the trucks passed through the city of Reykjavik, Berengar explained to the girl what he was driving. "It's called a truck. We're the lucky ones, sitting in this warm interior. If you look behind you, you'll see our gunner. Poor guy has to sit there in the frosty wind as we venture further into this icy wasteland." The young girl, whose hair was as light as platinum and whose eyes were as blue as ice, looked behind her and witnessed the stoic expression on the Marine's face, who operated the 2 cm flak gun mounted in the truck's bed. SIV felt a bit guilty upon seeing this, but Berengar assured her that the man was fine. "Don't worry, he's a Marine. He will be fine. I assure you, he has been through far worse than this." After saying this, the convoy left the city, with Berengar's truck leading the way and SIV as his guide.
The journey through the wastes of Iceland was not particularly long or eventful. The convoy had packed more than enough supplies to make the trip without any incidents, and before long, they found themselves at the entrance of a valley surrounded by a whirlwind of hail. Berengar closely observed the location and quickly guessed that this was indeed the land protected by Odin, serving as the entrance to Valhalla and the last bastion for those who still worshipped the old gods. However, he still asked for clarification. "Is this the place?" Siv silently nodded her head in agreement, confirming Berengar's suspicions. With a grit of his teeth, Berengar pressed the button, allowing him to talk through the radio and alert his troops. "We've arrived. Brace yourselves, boys. I don't know how nasty of a storm we are about to plow through, but we need to get inside that whirlwind." There was not the slightest bit of hesitation among Berengar's marines. They simply gritted their teeth and prepared themselves for the journey. After alerting the men, Berengar pressed his foot on the gas pedal and drove his truck forward into the hailstorm. Contrary to what he thought would occur, not a single bit of hail scratched the paint of his truck or any of those within his convoy. In fact, the hailstorm allowed the Germans to pass through without resistance. Just as quickly as they had entered the whirlwind, they soon found themselves on the other side, and what revealed itself was astonishing. Perhaps what could only be described as a paradise existed within the depths of the whirlwind. There was no snow, only greenery. A large lake lay in the center of the territory, from which the people who dwelled within drew sustenance. It was as clear as crystal and sapphire in color. The trucks drove through the area, to the astonishment of the locals, who had not exited this hidden domain in centuries. They dressed in the primitive attire of the Vikings and lived in longhouses. Their fields were more plentiful than what was natural, and their livestock were plump and healthy. Berengar, along with all of his soldiers, could hardly believe their eyes as their trucks came to a stop. A group of locals gathered with swords and spears in hand, afraid that perhaps the Christians had finally found them. There was no fear in their eyes, even as they gazed upon the marvelous technology of the distant future, as if death held no meaning to them. Berengar was the first from his convoy to step out into the open, and when he revealed himself, he was quick to speak, though he was truly surprised when he heard his voice speak a foreign language, one he could only assume was Old Norse. "I am Berengar von Kufstein. I have come to these lands at the behest of the gods. I mean you no harm and instead bring you gifts from the world outside." Though the people were cautious at first, they quickly changed their minds when Siv stood next to the foreigner's side. She smiled, as if she were among her real family, before running toward a woman who appeared to be in her late 20s, standing among the gathered crowd. "Mother, I am home." Berengar was only slightly surprised to see that his guide had familial connections to this hidden valley, which the world seemed to have forgotten. By the look on her face, she was clearly filled with joy to return, a sentiment the Kaiser found endearing. While Berengar enjoyed the sight of the familial reunion, a large, red-haired, and bearded man, clad in a mail shirt and a fur cloak, stepped forward to greet him. "Berengar, son of Sigurd, we have heard from the Valkyries that you would be arriving. Come, we must prepare you for the winter solstice. The All-Father is expecting you in Valhalla. I assure you, your men will be well taken care of in your absence." When Siv heard these words, she was more shocked than ever before. Even after witnessing all the wonders of technology the Germans brought with them, the fact that Odin had brought this foreigner here was the most unbelievable thing she had ever heard. Berengar smiled and nodded in response to the man's words. He was astonished that all language was converted to Old Norse in this location but quickly adjusted. He promptly gave orders to his men to bring out the gifts he had prepared for the villagers. "Bring out our gifts." In the next moment, the Germans exited their vehicles and began to carry items such as furs, silk, beer, cheese, bread, meat, and the finest swords the locals had ever seen. Berengar then stepped forward and greeted the villagers once more. "These are my gifts to you, brave few who still follow the ways of my ancestors. I hope you will make use of them in whatever way you best see fit." With this, Berengar made a good first impression on the townsfolk who lived in this hidden paradise. Over the next few days, he would be forced to undergo several trials and rituals to ensure he was worthy of entering Valhalla. Only after gaining the approval of these villagers would he be able to meet Odin himself. While Berengar and a company of his finest marines had entered a hidden paradise protected by the god Odin,
the majority of his sailors and marines who had accompanied the SMS Linda on this fateful journey were establishing ties with the local populace. The Kaiser had given strict orders before his departure to maintain operational security and for his troops to learn what they could from the local population about Iceland's economy, political structure, and religious background. Thus, Sergeant Wolf Engel and his squad of veteran Marines were currently walking through the streets of Reykjavik, speaking to the locals about the cathedral that stood proudly in the city center and the priest who ran it. The veteran soldier bore scars on his face from his days spent in the frontiers of Lindaheim, where he had constantly fought against the local savages over the past 5 years.
He had only recently been redeployed to the SMS Linda as part of its complement, a role he took great pride in.
As he was speaking with the locals, who seemed reluctant to discuss the church, the sergeant was forced to pull out a pouch of German thalers, which he presented to a young woman and her daughter, who was no older than 8, as a bribe. It was only then that they revealed what they knew about the local bishop. It's not something we like to talk about, but over the past 4 years, the bishop has been making some wild claims. I may not be a theologian, but some of the things he has said and done don't seem to fit with what I know about the church, the woman said, her eyes betraying a hint of worry as she struggled to avoid revealing too much information. However, her words alone were enough to convince the sergeant that something was seriously wrong in the city of Reykjavik, and he quickly inquired further.
Just what are these wild claims that the bishop has been making? The Icelandic woman bit her lower lip in frustration, unsure if she should say more.
However, her young daughter tugged at her sleeve and whispered something in her ear, which the German Marines did not hear. Whatever the little girl said, it was enough to convince her mother to cooperate. With a heavy sigh, she revealed everything she knew. It's not just me, but everyone in town is afraid to speak out against the bishop. After all, he has the backing of the local lord, who isn't afraid to throw people into the dungeons for criticizing the church. However, with your arrival, maybe something can finally be done about these crimes. The bishop claims that it is the will of God, as spoken by the Pope, for all families to send their firstborn sons to the church. We were forced to give up our eldest boy, who is around 10, to the bishop. Even when we attend service, we are not allowed to speak to our son. There are rumors that the bishop is taking the boys as his lovers, though nobody has ever been able to prove this. If that wasn't bad enough, the church demands a hefty tribute from the people of Iceland, leaving us with little to fend for ourselves. What little remains in our pockets is then taxed by Lord Reich. We can barely afford to feed our families, let alone keep our homes warm. When Wolf heard this, he felt a surge of rage within his heart. It was common knowledge that the Catholic Church had abused its authority to molest boys and steal money from the people. However, these misdeeds were only proven as a result of the German Reformation. Iceland was isolated, and though some traders came and went, it was possible for the bishop and the local lord to keep the papacy's destruction under wraps. This would explain why such blatant corruption was on full display, without fear of repercussions. The uneducated peasants would believe anything the bishop said, so long as he claimed the Pope had declared it. Obviously, there would be dissenters concerned about their families, but with the power of Lord Eric's henchmen, they could be easily disposed of. Here in Iceland lay the last bastion of Catholicism, where the local bishop abused his position to create a harem of underage boys and extort the local population to enrich himself. The very thought made Wolf and his squad's blood boil. Upon receiving this information, the sergeant quickly thanked the woman for her bravery. However, before he could return with this news to the captain, the Marines needed more evidence. Thus, they interviewed several other families, who, after a small bribe, were more than willing to confess what they knew about the Church of Reykjavik and its misdeeds. Before long, Wolf and his squad returned to the SMS Linda, where they reported their findings to the captain. The officer in command of the SMS Linda was a man named Victor Weiss. After hearing the accusations against the local bishop, there was a stoic expression on his face as he questioned the validity of what he had heard. "Are you sure about this?" "It's not that I don't believe you, but we are in a precarious situation. We are not the rulers of Iceland and, therefore, do not have the authority to apprehend and prosecute the local bishop, even if we were to discover undeniable evidence of his crimes. To do so could not only anger the local population but also outrage our allies in the Kalmar Union." Perhaps it was the captain's indecisiveness while Berengar was away, but Wolf was outraged at the very idea that they needed permission to stop an evildoer. Thus, he was quick to protest against his superior officer's diplomatic approach. With all due respect, Captain, I believe it is our duty, wherever we find ourselves, to stamp out evil where we see it. If the Kaiser were here, I have no doubt he would be more than willing to step on a few toes to rid the world of such atrocities. If you still think we require permission, then send a message to the German embassy in Copenhagen and request an investigation into this matter from King Alvar. Having heard this suggestion, Captain Weiss felt more confident in his ability to interfere in Iceland's affairs and was quick to follow the suggestion. After nearly 30 minutes, he heard Alvar's voice on the other end of the radio. The man sounded rather displeased that a lowly captain had summoned him, but when he heard the allegations against the Bishop of Reykjavik, he quickly changed his tune. Fucking Catholics. I knew it was a bad idea to leave Iceland to its own devices. While the Nordic Reformation has taken over most of the Kalmar Union, there are still pockets of Catholic churches here and there, with Iceland being the most notable exception. If you are convinced these rumors are true, then you have my permission to investigate them. Should you find evidence of these allegations, then by all means, deal with the Bishop of Reykjavik however you see fit. With that, Captain Weiss could sigh in relief. He then narrowed his eyes and turned his gaze towards Sergeant Engel, quickly giving him his orders. I want you to rally 2 squads of Marines. Your objective is to raid the Cathedral of Reykjavik and the bishop's personal lodgings. Find me some evidence of the church's misdeeds, and I will have the bastard hung at dawn. In response, Sergeant Engel saluted the captain and affirmed his orders. Yes, sir. With that, a detachment of Marines was sent through the streets of Reykjavik to look for evidence of the local bishop's wrongdoings. This would alert the local lord and force him to respond. Although the Germans had received King Alvar's permission to investigate, Eric would not easily accept this breach of his sovereignty. After all, he had close ties to the Bishop of Reykjavik, and if the church fell, so would his house. Despite being located in the frozen wastes of Iceland during midwinter, Berengar did not feel the slightest bit cold. In fact, he felt overdressed in this hidden paradise. The leader of the tribe of outcasts, who still followed the traditions of their ancestors, quickly led the Kaiser deeper into the village. He did not hesitate to introduce himself to the man who had been invited by the gods. My name is Wolfgar, son of Olaf. My people have lived here for centuries, free from the persecution of Christians. The gods provide us sanctuary, and in return, we worship them with all our hearts. This is the first time in our entire history of seclusion that an outsider like yourself has been allowed entry. Normally, the barrier would claim the lives of any intruders, but Odin has warned us of your arrival and the preparations that need to be made. When Berengar heard this, he immediately became confused. If no outsider had ever entered these lands, then how could SIV have come to be? Obviously, her mother was hidden in this sanctuary, but her father was that bastard Eric, Lord of Reykjavik. With this in mind, he quickly asked about the girl's past. If no outsider has entered these lands, then how was SIV born? As far as I know, her father is an outsider. A grim look appeared on the man's face as his gaze shifted to the teenage girl who was reconnecting with her mother. He shook his head inside before refusing to answer the question. That is a question best left answered by the girl's mother. It is not my place to say. Come, we have much to do, and little time to do it in. There are 3 trials you must pass before entering Valhalla's gates. Though you have proven yourself the world's greatest conqueror, your skills as a warrior are lacking. Berengar's brows furrowed immediately upon hearing these words. He cast an intense glare at Wolfgar, questioning what the man meant. Are these Odin's words? If I am not a warrior worthy of Valhalla, then who is? I have fought in more battles than any man in this tribe and have always emerged victorious. Wolfgar did not take offense at Berengar's statement. Instead, he scoffed in disbelief and quickly corrected the man's delusions. Oh, sure, you have fought many battles, some of which you have even participated in from the front lines. But with every major feat of glory you have achieved in personal combat, you have done so by overcoming your rivals with superior technology or the aid of your allies. It is not your will to fight that is in question, but your personal strength. Odin has set forth 3 trials of combat, which you must overcome solely with your own ability. Only then shall you enter Valhalla's gates.
Make no mistake, these are exceptional feats, ones that even the most hardened berserker will likely fail to achieve. You must prepare yourself for the possibility of death. However, the gods are not cruel. They have given you a fighting chance. Follow me, and we shall see you reborn as a man like no other who has come before you. Berengar did not understand what Wulfgar meant by this, but willingly followed the man to a mysterious pool of boiling water. Several naked maidens were kneeling in the pool, among them a woman adorned in feathers and bones, whom Berengar assumed was a seeress. Just as he was about to ask Wulfgar what was going on, the man spoke on his own. As I said before, the gods have given you a fighting chance and have chosen to bless you with a ritual. You will cleanse your body and mind of any impurities in this pool. Once you have done so, come meet me in the village below, and I will lead you to the first trial. Though Berengar was confused by what Wulfgar meant, he did not reject the offer. Instead, he stripped himself naked before entering the mystical pool, where he immediately felt as if every fiber of his being was being soothed by the magical water. Once submerged from the neck down, the seeress's attendants began to massage every inch of Berengar's body with the magical water, ensuring it fully soaked through his pores. They did not dare waste a single milliliter of the valuable substance. As someone who had always kept himself in great shape, Berengar prided himself on his body and what it was capable of. However, as a mortal man, there were natural barriers that prevented him from becoming something more. In this pool, the physical impurities in Berengar's body were melted away, creating the perfect human form. Only after the seeress dunked his head beneath the surface of the magical water and chanted her ritual did Berengar feel his mind washed over by the same mystical energy. When Berengar finally resurfaced, he was born anew. Though he had not become superhuman, he had become the apex of what a human could achieve in both body and mind, a blessing from the gods to ensure his body would endure the trials to come. After exiting the pool, Berengar looked back at his reflection and noticed that his skin was softer, his already handsome features were enhanced, and his age seemed to have decreased to his early 20s. The scars he had gained in warfare had disappeared, and any blemishes that previously marked his flesh were now gone. Perhaps most notable of all was the fact that the eye of Horus had been forcefully ejected from his skull, and in its place, a brand new sapphire eye, like the one he was born with, appeared. Berengar quickly scrambled into the pool to recover his divine artifact, where he stood in disbelief for some time. At the moment, he was completely incapable of understanding the transformation his body had undergone. Berengar was just about to ask the seeress what she had done to him when she spoke on her own. You have now reached the absolute limits of the human body and mind. Use this gift wisely, for I can only conduct such a ritual once in my life. I pray for your safety in the upcoming trials. It would be a pity if such a blessing were to go to waste. Though Berengar could feel the difference in every fiber of his being, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders, to hear it spoken by the seeress truly boggled his mind. He could only think that the gods of Germania must have something great in store for him to bless him with such a mighty boon. After bathing in the mystical pool, a pair of wool trousers were brought for Berengar to wear, and nothing else. Despite this lack of attire, he did not question it, and adorned himself with the article of clothing before regrouping with Wulfgar, who led him to the first trial. When Berengar arrived at the trial ground, he nearly lost control of his bowels. The entire tribe had gathered to witness this event, and the man could only stare like a dimwit at what was presented before him. He may have just reached peak human condition, but what waited for him in the pit below was a monstrous polar bear, large even by its species standards. A look of shock appeared in Berengar's eyes as he frantically cast a glance at Wulfgar, who was smiling at his misery. Before the Kaiser could speak, the chief bellowed in laughter and pushed Berengar into the pit. Kill the bear with your newfound strength, or die trying. Isiv stared at Wulfgar as if the man had gone mad, then shifted her gaze to her benefactor's figure, who had taken a wrestling stance as he circled the beast in the pit below. Even if Berengar had reached the pinnacle of human ability, fighting a polar bear with nothing but his own strength could only be described as suicidal. Despite the dire situation, there was not a hint of emotion on Berengar's exceptionally handsome face. Instead, he continued to circle the beast, looking for an opportunity to overcome it. The slightest mistake would undoubtedly result in his death, yet there was an intense desire for survival emanating from his mismatched eyes. No longer content with the dance, the beast charged forward recklessly, attempting to maul its opponent to death.
The creature's claws narrowly missed Berengar's neck as he slid to the side, ramming its head into the stone wall that separated the pit from those above. Seizing this opportunity, Berengar gnashed his teeth and roared as if he were a bear himself before charging his opponent. He put the beast into a headlock and used his newfound strength and leverage to lower the mighty bear to the ground, suffocating it with a choke known as the darse. The beast attempted to break free from Berengar's grasp and inflicted several severe slashes on the man's body. However, due to its awkward position and the weight of its opponent bearing down on its neck, it could only give one last struggle before its consciousness faded. Once the massive polar bear had passed out, Berengar put the beast into a rear headlock and broke its neck with his overwhelming strength. He could hardly believe how strong he had become. Although he recognized that if the creature had not slammed its head into the stone and dazed itself, he likely would be a dead man right now. With the creature's death, the crowd roared in excitement, jumping into the pit and beginning to skin the beast. Its hide would be turned into a cloak for Berengar to wear, symbolizing his ascendance to the status of a berserker. Wolfgar nodded his approval and announced an end to the first trial. Berengar Sighardsson, you have passed the first trial. Though you lucked out by outmaneuvering the beast, you still achieved your victory using only your own strength. I assure you, the next trial will be far more dangerous. Prepare yourself. Berengar sighed heavily and gazed upon his bleeding flesh, with a hint of regret in his eyes. If he had known that such dangerous tests awaited him, he might have thought twice before attempting to meet with Odin. However, after coming so far, there was no way he was going to quit, even if it meant his death. While Berengar was undergoing the trials of Odin in a distant corner of the world, Linda was conducting her own operations in the fatherland. After learning about the deaths of her adopted family, Minna had agreed to become an agent of German Imperial Intelligence. Currently, the Josian princess was undergoing strict training in the arts of espionage and assassination. Under the tutelage of Agent Friedrich Ziegler, Minna had learned swiftly how to be the perfect spy. As time passed and the Japanese empress grew impatient for her return, a romance began to blossom between the German interrogator and his Korean captive. This situation was closely monitored and orchestrated by Linda's hand. Currently, the director of intelligence sat in her office, reviewing a report written by the agent in question, who continued to train their newest recruit. With a slight smirk on her flawless face, Linda responded to this information with a satisfactory nod. Good, it seems everything is going as planned. The only problem I have now is stalling for more time. Empress Itami Raya was becoming quite impatient about the matter of Minna's release. Any longer, and she will start to suspect our plan. I must admit, the Japanese empress is a very intelligent woman, but she is also very unwise. I can't help but question many of her decisions since she assumed power in her homeland. What do you think, Hema? Is Minna ready to begin the operation? The deputy director of German Imperial Intelligence was sipping on a thermos of coffee when she heard her superior's question. She quickly glanced over the information before offering her opinion. In terms of espionage, the Josian princess has learned as much as she needs to complete the task. However, it would be dangerous to send Minna to Japan before her training is fully completed. Itami Raya was many things, but trustworthy is not one of them. The woman is paranoid, and the moment her plans are leaked to her rival, she will know that someone close to her has committed a grave betrayal. It will only be a matter of time before she discovers that Minna is responsible, and when that happens, we will lose one of our greatest assets in this Cold War. Linda nodded in agreement and sighed heavily as she sat back in her chair, staring at the documents in her hands. It was times like these, while her husband was away, that she often threw herself into her work as a coping mechanism. In the past, she had tried praying for his safety, but after learning of the supernatural, she had lost faith in religion. Whatever the Abrahamic God might be, he was neither all-powerful nor all-knowing, as the Christians had always claimed. Hema could tell her boss was distracted and tried to cheer her up. Linda, you know what your worst trait is? Over-worrying. I'm sure Berengar is fine. How many times has he encountered the supernatural before, and how many times has he returned to your loving arms in one piece? The man isn't stupid, he doesn't take unnecessary risks, especially not for the approval of ancient pagan gods. He will be fine, he always is.
When was the last time he did something needlessly stupid that put his own life at risk?
Hemma's words were greatly appreciated by Linda, who wore a bitter smile as she tried to push her worries from her mind. Of course, if she knew that Berengar was wrestling a polar bear in a fight to the death at this very moment, she would be livid at his sheer stupidity. Luckily, she had no way of knowing, so her mind was able to ease itself after some deep breaths. In the past, Hemma could not understand such worries. However, after entering a relationship with a man she deeply cared for, she too would feel nervous if he went on an expedition into an icy wasteland for a reason as crazy as interacting with an ancient pagan deity. As the deputy director of German Imperial Intelligence, Hemma was one of the few individuals in the world aware of its hidden supernatural elements, a secret she dared not share for fear of being labeled insane. After sitting in silence for some time, Linda sighed heavily and shifted her attention to matters of importance.
I'll give Friedrich a month to complete Minai's training. If they're not finished by then, we will have to begin the operation regardless. I'm running out of excuses to give the Japanese Empress that she will believe. Hemma nodded in understanding and agreed with the assessment. I understand. I will inform Friedrich of your decision.
Hopefully, that psycho pretty boy can get his act together by then.
Is there anything else you need before I depart?
Linda thought for a moment, then shook her head. She had everything she needed and did not want to hold up her deputy director any longer.
You are dismissed.
With that, Hemma bowed her head and departed from her superior's office, leaving Linda alone with her myriad of worries. Itami sat at her desk, gazing at a map of the known world that her agents had recovered from the markets of Anangpur. Though Germany had practically mapped out the entire world, they officially used maps that excluded their colonies as a means of counterintelligence. After all, Berengar did not want the world to know just how large the new world was or how much of it he had settled. Still, as Itami gazed upon this map, she could only feel intense anxiety. So much had changed in this world from the one she was used to. In truth, the Japanese Empress did not know how much of this was due to the butterfly effect caused by Berengar's actions and how much was already in place before his reincarnation in this world. What she did know was that Europe was all wrong. Berengar had accomplished what all others had failed to do in his previous life: unite the world's German speakers into a single, cohesive empire, one ruled by his dynasty as the ultimate rulers. From there, he had forced the entirety of Europe and the Middle East to kneel before him, as the supreme hegemon of the Western world. In contrast, Itami had brought all of Japan under her rule but had struggled to establish an international empire. If Berengar did not exist in this world, she might have chosen a different path to gain hegemony over the East. However, the realization that another person like herself lay to the west and was building an empire caused the young woman to panic and make many foolish decisions. She had built her empire on sinking sand, while Berengar had built his on solid rock. No matter how Itami looked at the geopolitical situation, she had been outplayed. If her rival emerged victorious in the upcoming war, it was very likely that his Reich could truly last 1,000 years.
Meanwhile, Itami's empire was one step away from total collapse.
Though she sat upon the throne, those beneath her only tolerated her reign because it was still useful to their purposes. No matter how much she regretted her choices in life, Itami only had one move to play: to continue her course full steam ahead. With a heavy sigh, she took a bite out of a chocolate bar imported from the Reich. Whether in this life or her past, the young woman enjoyed the taste of chocolate, a treat that helped soothe her worries. While munching on this treat, Itami gazed upon the portrait of Berengar hanging in her room and suddenly halted her actions. It was only now that she realized what she was doing. Her eyes darted back and forth between the painting of Germany's emperor and the label on her candy bar, which was clearly written in German. A deep sense of shame overwhelmed Itami as she realized she was giving her enemy exactly what he wanted. Her first reaction was to toss the candy bar towards the portrait. When the chocolate impacted, it tore a hole in Berengar's handsome face, causing Itami to cry out in agony as she rushed towards the painting.
Oh, no! What have I done?
Tears streamed from Itami's blood-red eyes as she gazed upon the damage she had caused. In the end, she picked up the candy bar once more and trembled as she ate what remained, as if she were some kind of junkie, incapable of stopping herself from injecting heroin into her veins, despite wanting nothing more than to be sober. Having finished the treat and thrown away the wrapper in shame, Itami climbed into her bed and cuddled with her Julian pillow while crying herself to sleep.
She was completely and utterly done with politics.
She hoped that when she woke up the next morning, it would not be in this luxurious palace, but in her old bed at West Point, where she could meet Julian in the library once more. Unfortunately, wishes were seldom granted. The sun began to set over the hidden corner of the world where Berengar found himself a guest of a long-forgotten clan. Having completed the first of his trials, a great feast was set for the Kaiser in celebration of his victorious contest. Berengar sat near a campfire with a horn of meat in one hand, and two local beauties clinging to each of his arms as he spoke of his previous conquests. The two young women gave him their full attention, captivated by the handsome man and his tales of wonder. "I must have been no older than 20 when I killed my first man. You see, my brother had sent assassins after me, in one of his many attempts to claim my rightful position as heir to our father's lands and titles. These men thought they would ambush me in the mountains during a hunting trip, but I knew they were coming. So, in the middle of the night, while my party was asleep, I grabbed my rifle and stalked through the hills, eventually entering a wooded clearing. As I silently made my way through the thicket, I stumbled upon one of the assassins who was relieving himself. Naturally, upon coming face to face with a man who wanted to kill me, the two of us fought to see who could arm himself first. Fortunately, that night I was the quicker man. I swiftly attached my bayonet and plunged its blade into the man's throat before he could even call for help from his comrades. Shortly thereafter, I climbed up a hill above and sniped at the remaining assassins. I killed a total of 4 men that night, and in doing so, gained critical evidence of my brother's misdeeds. Later, I used that evidence to banish the little coward from my family and its holdings. Of course, the bastard came back some time later seeking vengeance, and in the heat of battle, I slew him. It's funny, if my brother had just chosen to support me, rather than usurp my birthright, he would be living a life of unimaginable luxury and happiness right now." After telling this story, Berengar lost himself in thought for several moments. It had been many years since he last thought about Lambert and how things could have been if the boy hadn't been such a scheming prick. Looking back over a decade later, he couldn't help but think that had he reincarnated into this world a few years earlier, he might have prevented such a cruel fate. By inadvertently staring into the fire and remaining completely silent for several moments, Berengar further charmed the two young women who sat in his arms. They wanted to know more about this mysterious guest's life and how he had made his way from the heart of Europe to this secluded valley.
Siv watched her two elder cousins staring at Berengar with sparkling eyes and felt embarrassed on their behalf.
It was almost as if the two young women were meeting a man for the first time in their lives. When their mother saw this, she giggled and teased her daughter, "A bit jealous, are we?" A slight snort escaped from Siv's nostrils as she shook her head, rejecting the very idea.
"As if. The man is practically old enough to be my father."
This remark only caused Siv's mother to giggle further, an act that made the young girl pout. Berengar, meanwhile, continued to enjoy the company of the two young women for a little while longer before the food was brought out. Though the food was bland, Berengar did not mind. He was just about to dig in when the chief of the clan stood up and made a toast. To Berengar Sighardsson, may he complete his second trial tomorrow with the same skill and fervor as he did today. The entire clan, along with the company of Marines who escorted Berengar to this location, lifted their horns of mead and chanted the toast back to the chief. To Berengar. Berengar had long since grown accustomed to being the center of attention and was the first to drink the mead. After doing so, he dug into the roasted reindeer, savoring its savory flavor. Before long, the meal was completed, and the same seeress who had bathed Berengar in the pool of magical water stepped forward. As before, a headdress made of a reindeer's skull and raven feathers obscured the top of her face. When Berengar noticed the seeress approaching, he felt as he had when encountering other supernatural beings. Though the seeress was human, she dabbled in seer, which left a mystical energy around her, something Berengar could easily sense. In her hands, she held a white fur cloak with the head of a polar bear. She brought it forward and placed it upon Berengar's skull, the front paws of the beast wrapping around his chest, which could be tied into a knot or pinned with a brooch to secure the cloak tightly to his head. Berengar was slightly surprised but felt the spirit and characteristics of the bear overwhelming him. He gazed up at the seeress in shock, and a slight smile appeared on her eerily pretty face. This hide contains the hammer of the polar bear you have slain.
It took some effort on my part to calm the beast's spirit, but now, when you wear this cloak, you will embody the power and spirit of the bear. On behalf of our clan, I proclaim you, Berengar the Berserker.
In truth, Berengar knew very little about Norse traditions and beliefs. He had no idea what hammer was, but he could feel the might of the bear flowing through him. Whatever magic the CRS had performed was as real as anything else in this world. He could only nod his head in acceptance of this gift while continuing to drown himself in mead. Thus, Berengar continued to feast and charm the women of the clan with stories of past conflicts and victories. By the end of the night, nearly every woman and girl of age in the village wanted the man to take them to bed. However, he remained chaste. After all, he had enough drama with women in his life, and the last thing he needed was to add another to the list. Eventually, Berengar entered the longhouse that was provided for him and fell asleep by the fire, not realizing that he was sleeping in the home that belonged to Siv and her mother. After only a couple of hours, Berengar awoke with the need to relieve himself. He walked outside into the dead of night and took care of business. After returning from his little venture, he noticed Siv asleep, her head lying on her mother's lap, who appeared to be alert to his arrival. An awkward expression appeared on Berengar's face as he realized he had been sleeping in this woman's home without paying proper respects. Thus, he sat down by the fire and apologized. My apologies. I was so drunk that I didn't realize whose house I was sleeping in. Oddly enough, I feel sober already, with only a couple of hours of sleep. I should thank you for your hospitality, even though I haven't been the best of guests. A gentle smile emerged on the woman's face. It was only now that Berengar realized she was roughly his age, perhaps even younger. Despite this, her beauty was that of a much younger woman. Age seemed to have had little effect on her. She nodded in understanding before reassuring Berengar that he had done nothing wrong. There is no need. You underwent a difficult challenge today, and tomorrow will bring an even more precarious time. I understand the need to celebrate a great victory. However, if you're wondering why you feel so sober after drinking more than your fill, it likely has to do with the ritual you went through. It has been many years since the gods blessed a member of our clan with such a gift, but I've heard that such individuals can eat and drink more than before without suffering ill effects like weight gain or hangovers. So, given the circumstances, it's not unusual at all. The more Berengar learned about his newfound abilities, the more impressed he became. For some reason, he recalled his previous curiosity and felt compelled to ask the woman about herself and her daughter. Can I ask you a personal question? The woman knew exactly what Berengar wanted to know and quickly interrupted him. You haven't even asked me my name, and yet you want to know the specifics about how my daughter was born? Have you no shame? There was a clear teasing intent in her words, especially when Berengar looked at her pretty face and saw the light-hearted expression she wore. Just as he was about to apologize and ask for her name, she volunteered it. It's Brynhildr, by the way. This made Berengar chuckle as he made a joke about her name. You mean like the Valkyrie? Brynhildr simply smiled and nodded before continuing her story. That's correct, but if you wish to know the origin of my daughter's birth, that is a story best left for after you complete your trials. Assuming you live through them, that is. A faint expression of offense appeared on Berengar's handsome face as he cracked another joke with the woman, as if they were old friends. What do you mean if I live through them? Obviously, I'm going to survive. It's what I do best. This light-hearted response made the woman giggle. She knew just how severe Berengar's trials would be, yet the man did not appear concerned at all, even after wrestling a polar bear. Despite her initial reservations, Brynhildr found herself unconsciously falling for the man's charm, like every other woman in the village. Of course, she knew why this was. Not only had Berengar's appearance improved with the ritual, but his charisma had as well. So much so that, despite knowing this, Brynhildr couldn't take her eyes off him, as if he were a shooting star that would disappear in the next moment, leaving her awestruck. Noticing the atmosphere forming around him and this woman he barely knew, Berengar decided it was time to call it quits before he made a big mistake. He bid Brynhildr good night, then hopped onto a nearby straw mattress, wrapping himself in his new fur cloak. Leaving the woman on the other side of the room, she stared at his sleeping form with a hint of regret in her eyes.
When dawn rose the next day, Berengar would face his second trial, one that would challenge him mentally, physically, and spiritually.
While Berengar feasted and slept within a secluded village, hidden in the frozen wastes of Iceland, the majority of the soldiers he had taken on this journey were hard at work, investigating the bishopric of Reykjavik. 2 teams of Marines worked together to bring down the bishop and his allies. Sergeant Wolfangel led a squad of Germany's finest Marines to the city's cathedral in the dead of night. By then, the building was empty, giving them the ability to sneak in unnoticed. After picking the lock, Wolf was the first to enter, using the flashlight in his hand to search for evidence of the church's misdeeds. Upon entry, Sergeant Engel and his squad quickly noticed how luxurious the backwater cathedral was, a fact they were quick to comment on. It's one thing for the Grand Cathedral of Kufstein to be filled with gold and silver everywhere you look. After all, we built the damn thing to mock the papacy and their greed. But this timber chapel in the middle of nowhere is still so lavish? Something smells fishy here. A corporal nodded and looked over at a large golden cross, with the figure of Jesus Christ carved into its main beam. He couldn't help but break the 3rd commandment upon witnessing such a thing. Jesus fucking Christ, look at this. How much do you think this is worth? It's got to weigh at least 30 kilos. Now that's a cross to bear. The Marines continued to flash their lights throughout the building, looking for any possible evidence of wrongdoing. Eventually, they made their way to the back, where the bishop's personal office was. Once inside, they dug through books, letters, and any documents they could find. It was Sergeant Engel who was the first to uncover any real damning piece of evidence. "Take a look at this," he said. "It's a correspondence between Lord Eric and the Bishop of Reykjavik, dated roughly 4 years ago, shortly after the fall of the papacy. In this document, the bishop informs Lord Eric of the Pope's demise and suggests keeping it a secret from the people of Iceland so they can be extorted." The next one to speak was the corporal who had previously found the golden cross. "Over here, I think I've got something. It's the church's ledgers. I see an absurd amount of money coming in and going out. From what I can see, the people are clearly being extorted, and a large chunk of that is going back into Eric's pockets. Clearly, this is bigger than we initially thought." The more the Marines dug through the bishop's documents, the larger this conspiracy became. There were letters of correspondence to other parts of the Kalmar Union, exposing an enormous human trafficking ring of young boys and girls, many of whom were being sold into slavery. One thing quickly became certain: throughout Northern Europe, there was a network of former Catholic priests and Catholic sympathizers running an illegal slave trade. Most of the children were taken from Iceland and sold throughout Scandinavia, where they suffered God knows what abuse. Upon learning of this, Sergeant Engel could only confiscate the evidence and bring it back to his superior. This was way beyond his pay grade. Once aboard the SMS Linda, he handed the documents over to Captain Victor Weiss, who gazed upon them with a grim expression. After several moments of silence, the captain spoke to his subordinate in a grave tone. "Does anyone other than your squad know about this?" With a slight shake of his head, Sergeant Engel confirmed that only he and his men knew about this conspiracy, which allowed the captain to breathe a sigh of relief. He then explained in detail what was about to happen. "Once the other squad reports to me, I will give them the same talk I am about to give you. I will report this directly to Imperial Intelligence and let them handle it from here on out. As for the rest of you, not a single word about what you have found will ever escape your lips. Do you understand me?" Sergeant Engel was slightly surprised by this cautious remark. He did not understand why they should not inform the Kaiser directly when he returned from wherever he had gone. He voiced this concern quickly. "Shouldn't we alert the Kaiser? If he finds out, he would surely be able to do something about it." With a heavy sigh, Captain Weiss shook his head before explaining to the sergeant why this was a bad idea. "The Kaiser is a brilliant man, one with the utmost virtuous character. However, he is also passionate, and passion can lead to impulsiveness. If he discovers this horrific conspiracy, he might get so enraged that he does something foolish, like declaring war on his own allies in a vain attempt to rid the world of these evildoers. While the Kaiser might succeed in his endeavors, he would likely turn the world against him. Believe me when I say such matters are best reserved for the Spider Queen and her myriad of minions.
This cautious response was understandable given Berengar's character. If there was one crime the Kaiser despised most, it was the abuse of children.
The Reich's laws regarding such crimes were brutal but completely justified. Once convicted, the offender would be castrated and then sent to labor camps so atrocious they might as well be called gulags. In the modern world, such a sentence might be considered inhumane, but Berengar didn't see child abusers as human beings in the first place. Naturally, Sergeant Engel understood this and nodded in agreement.
However, one question remained on his mind, and he quickly voiced it. Wait. Who is the Spider Queen?
In response, Captain Weiss snorted and chuckled. It was common knowledge among higher-ranking officers who was in charge of Imperial intelligence, but this information was relatively unknown to the rank and file. When he answered the sergeant's question, the man found it hard to believe. The Spider Queen is what most people in the know call Kaiserin Linda von Kufstein behind her back. She may appear pretty and innocent on the outside, but in reality, she is the director of Imperial intelligence and the most terrifying woman on this planet. At my rank, dealing with Imperial intelligence is a common occurrence, and I assure you, the Kaiserin is the most capable person to track down these conspirators and make them suffer a fate worse than death, all without causing an international incident.
Sergeant Engel could hardly believe his ears. The two Kaiserins were practically idols in the Reich.
Every man and boy had their own fantasies about the two beauties, and their supporters numbered in the millions. One was generally a rabid fan of either Linda or Adela, but rarely both. For Wolf Engel, who was a devoted fan of Linda, the idea that his idol could be such a person was nearly impossible to accept. It took him some time to snap out of his stupor, and when he did, he heard Captain Weiss barking commands at him again. "That is all, Sergeant. You are dismissed. Before you go, remember to relay my words to your squad. Not a single word about this incident is to leave their lips, understood? I will only warn you one last time. This has become a classified matter for Imperial intelligence to handle."
Sergeant Engel was still in disbelief that Linda was known as the Spider Queen.
He simply nodded his head in a daze before walking out the door. Once alone, Captain Weiss could not help but curse aloud.
Fucking Catholics. Berengar awoke with the dawn. However, something was different this morning.
His mind was fresh and clear, unlike the groggy state he usually found himself in after first waking up. Typically, he would need a cup of coffee before he could even think about getting any work done. Yet at this moment, his mind was more awake than ever before in his life. After rising from his fur cloak, which he had used as a cover the night before, Berengar noticed Brynhildr was cooking breakfast. Meanwhile, Siv was still asleep in another corner of the longhouse. His first instinct was to play a trick on the mature beauty, but the moment he stepped out of bed, she heard his feet touch the floor and quickly greeted her guest.
"Awake already?
Come, enjoy some eggs, sausage, and a glass of fresh milk. You're going to need your strength for today's trial." Partially disappointed that he couldn't be mischievous so early in the morning, Berengar sighed and did as he was instructed, admitting defeat for the day. He quickly ate a large share of eggs, sausage, and milk. It was immediately apparent that his appetite had increased, no doubt due to the rebirth his body had undergone. Despite this, Brynhildr continued to feed him with a happy smile on her face, as if her storehouses were unlimited. She gracefully cooked more servings for Berengar until he no longer felt the need to eat. Once satisfied, he leaned back in his chair and thanked his host for her hospitality.
It was truly delicious. Thank you for putting up with me.
Exactly as Berengar had expected, the woman quickly bowed her head and replied with a humble response. "It was my pleasure.
Assuming you make it back from your trial alive, I will prepare a similar breakfast for you tomorrow. If you have any requests, you can tell me when you return."
After finishing his milk, Berengar placed his horn on the table and stood up from his seat with a confident expression. He headed for the door, leaving behind a simple response before exiting the longhouse, "I look forward to it." Only after the man's figure disappeared did Siv awaken from her slumber. She wiped her eyes, exhausted, and looked around her home, noticing that Berengar had already left. Realizing this, she scrambled out of bed and into proper clothes as if struck by a bolt of lightning. Brynhildr only smiled and shook her head as her daughter ran out of the house, chasing after her benefactor with a piece of bread in her mouth. By the time Siv finally caught up with Berengar, he was in the center of the city, wearing only wool trousers as he entered a small clearing used for duels. This time, it was not Wolfgar but the seeress who was announcing the trial. With a stoic expression on her eerily beautiful face, she announced the horror Berengar would face that day. Berengar Sighardsson, you are a conqueror unrivaled throughout history. Though you have fought on the front lines of war, you did not use your own strength and skill to defeat your enemies. Instead, you relied on superior technology and the aid of your allies to overcome your opponents. The gods have seen fit to give you a proper contest with an enemy from your past who once bested you in single combat. You will not be fighting here in the mortal realm, but rather in a temporary plane created by the god Odin to oversee your duel. Step forth and enter the battleground, where only the gods shall bear witness to your trial. After saying this, Berengar stepped up to the seer, who placed 2 fingers on his forehead and instantly sent him into a pocket dimension. The world around Berengar looked nearly the same as where he had previously stood, but he found himself alone, with nothing but a sword in one hand and a shield in the other. Just as Berengar was about to search for his opponent, a voice called out to him, sending shivers down his spine. "Brother!" Berengar immediately turned around and gazed at the other end of the dueling pit. To his dismay, he saw a teenage boy he had not seen in over 10 years. Lambert stood at the opposing side with a hate-filled gaze in his ocean-blue eyes. Berengar could only stammer in shock as he tried to express the thoughts in his mind. It can't be. Despite struggling to cope with this reality, there was no mistaking it. The boy at the other end of the dueling ring was his long-deceased brother Lambert, or rather, the spirit of Lambert. The hatred contained in the boy's eyes was enough to devour entire galaxies as he cursed at the men who had sent him to the depths of hell. "What? Are you surprised to see me? It's the head, isn't it? I know what you did to my skull after you killed me. It's not just that. I know everything that has happened after you shot me through the chest. Hell has been especially cruel to me. When I'm not being tortured in a boiling lake of blood, I'm forced to watch everything that my dearest brother has accomplished after he sent me to the pit. However, now I've been given another chance. If I kill you here, we will trade places. That is the agreement Odin has made with Satan. You will take my place as a tortured soul in the devil's realm, and I will be given a new life. The first thing I will do is rape that red-headed witch of yours and dine on the flesh of her accursed children. Come at me, brother. Let's end this once and for all." Berengar did not even get a chance to respond to Lambert's hatred, as the boy jumped into the ring and unleashed his sword. Knowing what was at stake, Berengar silently cursed Odin in his heart before raising his shield in defense. The 2 brothers circled one another in silence for some time before Lambert unleashed an attack with his sword. With an angled slash toward his brother's neck, the boy attempted to claim Berengar's life from the start. It had been a long while since Berengar had last trained with a sword, and he knew practically nothing about using a shield. However, he did his best to deflect the boy's attack before piercing toward his heart. But was defeating a skilled knight so easy? Berengar could only curse himself for forsaking his swordsmanship in recent years, as he struggled to block and deflect the oncoming blows that Lambert lashed at him. In fact, Berengar was at a complete disadvantage, as he was well accustomed to training with the sword while only having one eye. Now that his sight had been restored, everything felt off. Soon enough, first blood was spilled as Lambert's cut nicked his brother's abdomen, spilling the sanguine liquid of life all over the grass beneath their feet. Berengar gritted his teeth, pressed forward, and swung his sword toward Lambert's face with a reverse slash. In doing so, he cut the boy's cheek, an act that would only further aggravate his opponent. Realizing he had been careless, Lambert readjusted his position and attacked with increased intensity. For every third strike he made, one would pass Berengar's defenses and cut him. Just when Berengar thought he had gotten accustomed to the duel, a sword slash came out of nowhere. A vertical strike from a high guard cut through Berengar's right eye, just as it had so many years ago. After losing the sight in his right eye for the second time in his life, Berengar was thoroughly enraged. He gazed upon Lambert with his one good eye and cursed the boy, who was mocking him from afar. "You fucking bastard. I just got the damn thing fixed, and yet, for the second time in my life, you have stolen my sight. The joke's on you, though.
After you died, I became quite proficient in the sword with only one eye. Now I can finally test what I have learned.
As if he were a phoenix rising from the ashes, Berengar stepped forward with newfound zeal and increased the intensity of his attacks. For every slash or stab that Lambert attempted, Berengar expertly avoided it and countered. In the end, the two men had cuts all over their bodies, and pools of blood gathered beneath their feet. Their shields shattered from the sheer volume of blows they had received in this fight. The hatred between these two brothers could not be buried without one entering the grave. In a desperate attempt to kill his brother, Lambert lunged forward. However, to his surprise, Berengar did not try to avoid it. Instead, he took the blade into his gut before grabbing hold of Lambert's wrist with his free hand. The boy struggled to break free, but he could not. After all, Berengar's strength was superior to his own. Lambert looked in horror at his brother's murderous smile before feeling the burning sensation of cold steel piercing through his heart. The last thing he saw in this temporary plane of existence was the sight of his elder brother spitting upon his face and saying the words he least wanted to hear.
"Go back to hell where you belong."
Having said this, Berengar pulled his sword out of Lambert's heart and decapitated the boy as he fell to his knees. The severed head of the tormented spirit rolled for several feet before it, along with the rest of the body, turned to ash, which faded away with the wind. No longer capable of standing on his own, Berengar fell to one knee, where he heard the sound of clapping in the distance, followed by a single phrase.
"Well done."
That was the last thing Berengar remembered before he fell to the ground completely unconscious. By the time he awoke the next day, his wounds would be healed as if they had never occurred, all but one. His right eye, which had been restored during his rebirth, was beyond repair. Luckily, he still had the Eye of Horus in his possession.